Hey there, and welcome back. Whatever this day has handed you, however long and full its hours have been, you can set all of it down now and let the room grow soft and dim around you, and let your breath come slower and easier in your chest. There is nothing more for you to carry tonight. Let the warmth of the bed gather you in, and come away with me a long way back, more than 500 years, into the tale of a house of children who were born to the very brightest fortune England could offer, and who would live to see that bright world turn upon them more cruelly than almost any children of their age. Tonight, we are following the lives of the brood of a queen, a whole nursery full of them, 12 children in all across the years. Princes and princesses of the ruling house of England. Raised in a splendour that the common run of people could scarcely imagine, marked from their cradles for thrones and crowns and the grandest marriages in Christendom. They were the brood of the most powerful man in the kingdom, and the world lay open before them, and there seemed to be nothing that the years could hold for such a family but glory. And then, within the space of a single spring, the bright life of that nursery came crashing down. Their father died without warning. 2 of the little princes vanished into a grey tower by the river and were never seen again. A grown son of the family was led out and beheaded. And the queen, their mother, fled with her daughters into the cold stone refuge of a great church, hunted and stripped of everything, while a kinsman they had trusted seized the crown that should have been theirs. It is one of the most haunting stories of that whole haunted age, the fall of these royal offspring, and we are bound tonight, far into the small and quiet hours, toward the heart of it, and toward the one strange mercy that waited at the very end of all the sorrow. For out of the wreck of that broken family, against every likelihood, one daughter would rise to wear a crown of her own, and to heal with her own marriage the long and bloody quarrel that had devoured her brothers. But that is a long way off down the road of this night. There is a family to come to know first, and a whole vanished age to enter, and we begin where the house began, with a queen and the brood she brought into a perilous time. Before we cross over into their century, there is one small thing I would ask of you. It is a quiet comfort to me in the dark, to know a little of who is keeping me company tonight. So if you feel inclined, leave a line or two below to say from which corner of the world you are listening, and how late the hour has grown where you are lying. I look through the notes that come, every one of them, and there is a soft pleasure in imagining all those scattered and shadowed rooms, each of them hushed, each given over for a little while to the same old story as the night comes down. And if these slow journeys into far-off times are something you would like to find your way back to, the simplest way is to subscribe whenever the wish should happen to come to you, offered gently and never pressed. And another of these quiet evenings will make its way to you in time. That is the whole of what I wish to say. From here on, the night belongs to them. Picture this: a great chamber in a royal palace, warm with firelight and the glow of many candles, its walls hung with rich tapestries and its floor strewn with sweet herbs, and within it a whole company of children, the little ones of a sovereign and queen of England. There are small girls in gowns of fine wool and silk, and small boys with the bearing already of princes, and nursemaids and rockers and tutors moving among them, and all the warm bustle of a royal nursery at the height of its fortunes. These are children who have never known want or fear, who have been wrapped from birth in every comfort and each honour that a kingdom could give, whose smallest needs are tended by a small army of servants, whose futures are already being shaped into alliances with the greatest houses of Europe. They are the most fortunate children in all of England, and on this bright day, with the fire crackling and the candles burning and all the glittering machinery of royalty arranged for their keeping, it would seem the wildest madness to imagine that any real harm could ever come to them. And yet the years that lay ahead of these young ones held a measure of grief and terror that few families of any rank have ever been made to drink, and it is their tale, the story of a queen's 12 children, that we are going to follow tonight, from this warm and shining beginning all the way to its strange and scattered end. The mother of this great family, the woman at the heart of it, was a woman whose own life had been one of the most startling reversals of the age. Lifted in a single stroke from a modest estate to the throne of England, and her own tale is where the story of her brood must begin. She had not been born to royalty, this queen. She had come of a house of the middle rank of the nobility, well connected, but far from grand. And her first marriage had been to a simple knight, a man of no large estate who held to the losing side in the long civil wars that were tearing the kingdom apart in those years. By that first husband, she had 2 sons while she was still young, and then her knight was killed in one of the great battles of the wars, struck down fighting for a cause that went down to defeat, leaving her a young mother with 2 little boys and very little to keep them on. It was a hard beginning, and by every ordinary reckoning, her life should have settled into the quiet and straightened round of a poor gentlewoman, raising her fatherless sons in obscurity, far from any thought of crowns. That it did not, that this widow of a defeated knight became instead the crowned queen of England and the mother of princes, is one of the famous romances of the age, and the beginning of everything that followed. For the young sovereign who had won the throne in those wars, a tall and handsome and pleasure-loving man in the first flush of his strength, met the beautiful woman and was undone by her. And where his counsellors looked for him to make a grand foreign marriage to seal an alliance, he married instead, for love, this portionless widow of the enemy side. He married her in secret, telling no one, and only made the match known to his astonished court some months afterward, to the scandal and fury of the great lords, who had been planning quite another future for him. It was a marriage that broke every rule of royal policy, a king throwing himself away, as his critics saw it, on a bride far beneath him, for no cause but desire. But it was done, and could not be undone. And the modest bride was crowned queen with all the ancient splendour, raised at a stroke above the proud nobility who despised the match. She brought with her into her new royalty her 2 young sons of her first marriage, the small boys who were suddenly the stepsons of a king, and she would go on to give her royal husband a wide family besides. So that the nursery of the sovereign filled over the years with a whole brood of half-brothers and half-sisters, the boys and girls of the knight and the brood of the sovereign, all raised together in one royal household. It is with those children, the 12 of them, that we are concerned tonight, and we shall come to know them one by one as the night goes on. But a word first about the realm into which these children were born, for it was not the calm and peaceful realm that such splendour might suggest, but a kingdom only lately torn by civil war, and still trembling with the aftershocks of it. For a generation and more, the great families of England had been at one another's throats in a long and bitter quarrel over the crown. 2 branches of the royal house contending for the throne with fire and sword, dragging the entire nobility into their feud and drenching the land in the blood of its own lords. Their father had won his crown in that quarrel, fighting his way to the throne over the bodies of his enemies. And though he held it now in seeming security, the old hatreds were not dead, but only sleeping. The losing side not destroyed, but only beaten down, biding its time. It was an age in which fortunes could be made and unmade overnight, in which the highest in the land might be cast down without warning, in which no peace was ever quite to be trusted. And into this world of hidden danger, the royal children were born, in all their splendour, heirs to a throne that had been won by violence and might yet be lost the same way. The brightness of their early days was real, but it rested upon a foundation that was anything but firm, and the danger that underlay it would one day rise up and engulf them. The quarrel that shadowed the whole lives of this brood, and that would, in the end, destroy so many of them, was the long and bloody struggle men would afterward call the Wars of the Roses, and it is worth understanding. For the young ones were born into the very heart of it. For a generation and more, 2 branches of one royal family had been locked in a deadly contest for the crown of England. Two lines descended from a common ancestor, each claiming the throne by its own reckoning, each gathering its partisans among the chief lords of the land. The one house and the other came in time to be remembered by the badges they were said to wear, a white rose for the one house and a red for the other, so that the whole quarrel took its name from those emblems. A pretty name for an ugly business of battle and murder and revenge. It was a war fought not by foreign armies, but by Englishmen against Englishmen, by the nobility of the land tearing one another to pieces over the crown. And it dragged on for decades in a weary cycle of risings and battles and reprisals. The crown changing hands and changing back, the great families bleeding themselves white in the quarrel. The father of these small ones was the champion of one of the two houses, the White Rose, and he had won the throne by the sword in the thick of that long struggle, fighting his way to the crown over the bodies of his enemies and the rival claimants. He was a famous soldier, this father, and had never lost a battle. And by the time his children were growing up, he had beaten down the rival house and killed or scattered its leaders and seemed to have made his throne secure at last. But the hatreds bred by such a war do not die easily, and beneath the surface of his strong reign, the old enmities still smouldered, the partisans of the beaten house still nursing their grievances, the losers biding their time. The siblings grew up in the brief sunlit interval when their father's victory seemed complete and the long wars seemed over. But the wars were not over, only sleeping, and the same deadly feud that had carried their father to the throne would rise again in their own generation to consume them. They were the children of a civil strife, born in a lull between its storms, and the storm would come again for them. It is one of the cruel ironies of their story that the final convulsion of that strife, the one that destroyed the boys and girls and ended their house, came not from the old enemy across the divide, but from within their father's own family and party, from the uncle who turned upon them after their father's death. The long struggle of the two roses had been, for the most part, a war between the two great houses, but its last and most terrible act was a treachery within one house. A brother's son cast down by a brother, the white flower tearing at itself. And the very end of the whole quarrel, when it came, would be a wedding rather than a battle, the union of the last heirs of the two warring houses, which joined the red and the white at last, and brought the long struggle to its close. And that healing marriage, as we shall see, would be made by the eldest daughter of these very children, so that the family ruined by the strife would also, through its one surviving daughter, be the brood that ended them. Of all her children, the eldest were the two boys of her first marriage, the sons of the knight who had died in the wars, and these two half-brothers of the royal brood deserve our attention first. For their fortunes too were bound up in the family's rise and would be swept up in its fall. When their mother became a queen, these boys, who might otherwise have grown up in obscurity as the fatherless sons of a minor knight, were lifted with her into the dazzling world of the court, the stepsons of the sovereign. Suddenly, persons of consequence, with the whole road opened before them. The elder of the two grew into a man of the court in his mother's golden years, advanced and enriched, and married into broad estates, raised to a high title of his own, one of the favoured courtiers who basked in the sunshine of the Queen's good fortune. The younger boy too was provided for and brought forward, given a place in the household of his small royal half-brother, the little prince who was the heir to the throne, set to serve and companion the boy who would one day be king. For a long while, the fortunes of these two half-brothers ran with the rising tide of the whole house, and they shared in all its splendour two more bright figures in the glittering company of the Queen's relations. Yet there was a shadow over the place of these half-brothers, though no one could have seen it in the golden years, for they belonged to their mother's own family rather than to the royal blood. And that distinction would prove, when the storm came, to be a matter of life and death. The great lords of the old nobility had never forgiven the Queen her sudden elevation, nor the Queen's habit of advancing her own kindred to wealth and honour, and the resentment against her relations ran deep and bitter beneath the surface of the court. While the monarch lived and held the balance, that resentment was kept in check, but it was there, waiting, and her sons and brothers and kindred were marked men in the eyes of those who hated the upstart family that had climbed so high. When at last the monarch died and the balance broke, it would be precisely upon her own kindred that the first blow would fall, and the younger of these two half-brothers, the boy set to serve the little prince, would be among the very first to pay with his life for the crime of belonging to the wrong family. But all of that lay far ahead in the unimagined future, for now there were only two fortunate brothers sharing in their family's golden hour, and a nursery filling, year by year, with the sons and daughters of the king. To understand the hatred that would one day fall upon these offspring, we must understand the resentment that gathered around the clan of their mother, her kindred, whose sudden rise to greatness made them the most envied and detested people in the kingdom. For when the ruler married his portionless widow, he married not only her, but her whole numerous family, a whole tribe of brothers and sisters and cousins who came flooding to the court in her train, all of them needing places and titles and advantageous marriages befitting the new kinship with the crown. And the ruler, doting on his queen, provided for them all with an open hand, marrying her sisters to the heirs of the proudest houses, advancing her brothers to high office and rich estates, raising her father to a high title, until that family seemed to have fastened itself upon each quarter of the nobility and to be carrying off all the best prizes of the realm. It was a dazzling rise for a family of the middle rank, lifted in a few years to the very heights, but it was bought at the price of the bitter envy of the older nobility, who saw the upstart kindred seizing the marriages and the offices and the honours that they had thought their own. The resentment against the Queen's relations ran deep and grew with the years, for the old lords could not forgive the sudden greatness of these newcomers, nor the king's lavishing of favour upon his wife's relations, nor the way these newcomers seemed to stand between them and their sovereign. The foremost of the old nobles, the mighty earl who had helped the sovereign to his throne, was driven into open revolt in part by his fury at the rise of her house. And the quarrel between the old nobility and the new royal kindred became one of the running sores of the reign. While the sovereign lived and held the balance, the resentment was contained, kept from breaking into open violence by the strength of his hand. But it was always there, the deep and bitter grudge of the old blood against the new, waiting only for the king's restraining hand to be removed. And when at last he died and the balance broke, it was upon the hated kindred that the first and the fiercest blows would fall. For the men who had envied them in their glory now took their revenge to the full. These children's misfortune was bound up from the start with their mother's family, for they were tainted in the eyes of the old nobility with the same upstart blood, and the hatred of the Woodville name would be turned in the end against the Queen's brood themselves. There was one engine above all that drove the old nobility to fury, and it was the marriage bed for every eligible heir and heiress in the land. In those years seemed to be carried off for one of the Queen's kin, and each such match was a prize snatched from under the nose of some older house. The new Queen had brought to court a swarm of brothers and sisters, all of whom had to be settled, and one by one they were matched by the sovereign's contrivance into the proudest stocks of the realm. Her sisters wedded to the sons of earls, her brothers matched with great heiresses, her father raised to a high earldom of his own. By these marriages this family fastened itself upon every quarter of the nobility, its blood mingling with the most ancient and grandest in the kingdom, its kindred multiplying into a great connection that reached into each great house. And what had been a family of the middle rank became, in a few short years, the centre of a vast web of noble alliance. To the old peers, this swift and systematic capturing of the best marriages was a deep affront, for each match that went to a Woodville was a match that did not go to one of themselves. Each heiress carried off by the queen's brothers, and heiress lost to the older houses. They saw the upstart family seizing the prizes that they regarded as their own by right of blood and antiquity, and they resented it bitterly. The more so because they could do nothing against it, while the ruler lived to protect his wife's kindred. The web of marriages that she spun to secure her kin's greatness thus became, in the end, a web of enemies, for it bred against that family the concentrated hatred of an entire peerage that felt itself robbed and slighted. And when the ruler died and the protecting hand was gone, all that stored resentment broke loose at once, and the family that had woven itself so cleverly into the fabric of the nobility found that it had woven instead the net of its own destruction. The first child of the royal marriage, the eldest of the queen's children by the king, was a daughter, born in the early years of the reign, when her parents were still young and the throne still new. And she would prove in the end the most remarkable of all the brood, though no one could have guessed it from her quiet beginnings. She was named for her mother, this firstborn princess, and she came into the world amid rejoicing, for though a daughter was not the longed-for son, she was proof that the marriage was fruitful and the line would continue. From her earliest days, she was a person of consequence. This princess, her hand already a thing to be bargained over in the high game of royal marriages, her future already the subject of grave negotiation among kings and counsellors. She ripened into a gentle and a beautiful girl, fair-haired and mild of temper, beloved at her father's court, and as the firstborn of the young princes and princesses, she held a special place among them, half a second mother to the babies who came after, the steady elder sister of a growing brood. Of all the queen's young ones, she would travel the strangest road, from princess to outcast to queen, and she would outlast them almost all. But in these early years, she was simply the eldest daughter of a fortunate house, the first flower of a nursery that would fill, year upon year, with her brothers and her sisters. The eldest of all the royal children, the firstborn daughter, deserves to be known a little more closely, for she was the one who would carry the whole family through the darkness and into a new day, and her character was the steady thread that ran through all the chaos of her house's fall. She was, by every account that reaches us, a gentle and a gracious girl, fair of face and fair of nature, mild and kind and devout, beloved by those who knew her, and gifted with a sweetness of temper that never seemed to fail her even in the worst of her trials. From her earliest years she was a person of high consequence, the eldest child of a king, her hand sought by the foremost princes. She was solemnly promised, while still a girl, to the heir of a foreign throne, and was reared for a time in the expectation that she would one day be a foreign queen, taught the language and the ways of the country she was to rule. That match, like so much else, would dissolve when the alliance behind it failed, and the proud betrothal came to nothing, leaving her hand free for the strange destiny that awaited it. What set this firstborn daughter apart was not beauty or rank alone, but a deep steadiness of soul, a capacity to endure and to wait and to keep her dignity through every reversal, that would carry her through sufferings that might have broken a harder spirit. She would see her father die and her brothers vanish, and her own royal name stripped from her. She would live as a half-captive at the court of the man who had destroyed her family, her future utterly dark. And through it all, she kept her gentleness and her patience, bending before the storms and never breaking, waiting with a quiet fortitude for whatever fortune would bring. It was this steadiness, as much as her royal blood, that fitted her to be the bridge between the old order and the new, the one fixed point around which the shattered family might be drawn together again. And when at last the wheel turned and lifted her to a throne, she brought to her queenship the same gentle and enduring nature that had carried her through the dark years, and made of herself one of the best loved of all the queens of her line. Of all the queen's children, She was the one in whom the line's hopes survived, and she did not fail them. It is worth saying a word about the looks of this family, for they were famed in their own day for their comeliness, a thing remarked upon by all who saw them. The father was reckoned one of the handsomest men of his age, a giant in stature, taller by a head than common men, strong-built and golden in his youth, with a presence and a bearing that turned every eye. Men spoke of his person as one of the wonders of the court, and it was part of the spell he cast upon all who came near him. The mother, too, was a famous beauty, a woman whose loveliness had been one of the chief causes of her astonishing rise, with pale gold hair, it was said, that fell in a shining flood, and features that had captured a king. This loveliness was a kind of power in itself, and it was through her fairness, as much as anything, that the whole great drama of the family had begun. From two such parents, the children inherited a notable comeliness, remarked upon throughout their lives. The sisters in particular were praised for their sweet faces, golden of hair and sweet of face, like their mother, graceful and lovely girls, who did credit to the comely stock from which they sprang. The eldest, who would one day be a queen, was especially noted for her gentle loveliness, sung by those who knew her. The sons, too, were fine and promising boys, comely and well-grown, the very image of their splendid father in miniature. It was a beautiful family, in short as well as a fortunate one, and their comeliness was part of the brightness that hung about them in their golden years, adding to the splendour of their state the further grace of personal beauty. There is an added pathos in it, perhaps, that children so fair and so favoured should have come to so dark an end. The comeliness of the house no more able to save it than its greatness was. But in their bright years, their good looks were one of the glories of the court, and the bright faces of the royal brood were among the ornaments of the reign. After the firstborn daughter came others, for the queen proved abundantly fruitful, and the royal nursery filled steadily through the bright years of the reign with a succession of princes and princesses. There came a second daughter, a girl who grew up gentle and well-loved, but who was fated to die young, carried off by sickness while still in her early girlhood, before she could be married or come to any estate of her own. The first of the royal brood to be lost, and a foretaste of the sorrows that lay ahead. And there came a third daughter, who lived where her sister died and came to womanhood, and would play her part in the momentous events that were to come. These early daughters of the nursery were reared together in the queen's household, raised in the careful and luxurious manner of royal children, taught their letters and their needlework, and their music, and the grave deportment expected of princesses. Surrounded always by the soft attendance of nurses and servants, and the steady ceremony of a grand household. They were daughters, and so not the heirs their father most desired. But they were valuable all the same pieces in the marriage market, ornaments of the court, and dearly loved, by all the signs, by the mother who bore them and the father who doted on his children. The longed-for son, when at last he came in the strangest and most frightening circumstances, for he came not in a palace amid rejoicing, but in the dark refuge of sanctuary. While his father was a fugitive across the sea, and his family's fortunes lay in ruins. For a sudden turn of the long civil wars had driven the sovereign from his throne for a time, sending him fleeing abroad while his enemies seized the kingdom, and the queen, heavy with child and in deadly danger, had fled with her daughters into the holy ground of a famous church, claiming the ancient protection of holy ground against those who would have seized her. And there, in that frightened shelter, with her husband an exile and her future utterly dark, the queen gave birth at last to her first son. The son her marriage had so long wanted, a prince come not to splendour, but to peril, in a bare lodging within the precincts of the church. It was a strange and an ominous beginning for the boy who was meant one day to be king, born in flight and fear rather than in triumph. And there is a dark irony in it that history would not miss. For the sanctuary that sheltered his birth would shelter his family again in his own hour of catastrophe, and the boy cradled in sanctuary would meet his ruin not many years after he left it. Behind the story of all this brood stands the figure of their mother, the queen who bore them, and it is worth pausing on what it meant to be the mother of so wide a brood in that age. For her motherhood was the thread that bound the entire house together. To bear 12 children across the years of 2 marriages was a labour and a peril that we can scarcely imagine now. For childbirth in that age was the gravest danger of a woman's days. And every one of those 12 confinements was a passage through the shadow of death. No woman, however high her rank, was spared that danger. The queen upon her rich bed and the poorest woman in her hovel faced the same peril when their hour came, and many did not survive it. That the queen passed through it 12 times and lived was itself a kind of fortune. That she saw so many of her boys and girls grow in an age when so many infants died was a fortune greater still, though it would be repaid with a grief beyond the common measure. For the mother of these boys and girls was bound to them by all the deep love that a mother bears, and her story is in great part the tale of her children, of her rejoicing in their births and her grief at their deaths, of her fierce striving to protect them when the storm came down. We have seen her bear her first royal son in the fear and squalor of sanctuary, with her husband in exile and her fortunes in ruin. We have seen her gather her children about her and flee again into that same refuge in the hour of her final catastrophe, and we shall see her, to the very end, striving and scheming for the brood who survived, plotting the marriage that would lift her eldest daughter to a throne even out of the depths of her own disgrace. Whatever else may be said of this queen, she was a mother before all, fierce and devoted in the love of her children, and the deepest of all her sufferings were the sufferings she bore as a mother, the burying of her infants, the loss of her princes, the deep anguish of watching the bright family she had raised brought down into ruin and death. The story of the queen's children is also the record of the queen's heart, and there is no understanding the one without the other. The birth of the heir in the refuge of sanctuary, in the midst of his family's ruin, was the fruit of an earlier storm that had nearly destroyed the house years before the final catastrophe. And that earlier crisis is worth the telling, for it was a foretaste of all that came after. In the early years of the reign, the sovereign's throne was suddenly shaken by the revolt of the mightiest of his nobles, the proud earl who had done more than any other man to set him upon the throne and who now turned against him, driven in part by his fury at the rise of the queen's family. This overmighty earl rose in arms, and for a season he had the king at his mercy, and in that first convulsion her own father and one of her brothers were seized and put to death by the rebels, the first of her kindred to perish, a grim foreshadowing of the deaths that would come in the later storm. The monarch broke free of the earl's power for a time, but the earl rose again, and this time joined hands with the old enemies of the monarch's house, and drove the king clean out of the kingdom, so that he fled overseas into exile, while his enemies seized the realm. It was in this dark passage, with her husband a fugitive abroad, and her house's cause in ruins, that the queen fled into sanctuary for the first time, and there gave birth to her eldest son, the future king, in fear and privation. For a few months it seemed that the house was utterly overthrown, the ruler in exile, the old enemy restored, the queen huddled in her refuge with her infant son and her little daughters. But the wheel turned once more, as it was always turning, and the ruler came back. He returned with a small force, gathered his friends about him, and met his enemies in 2 pitched battles, in which the mighty earl was killed, and the old enemy crushed at last. And the sovereign was restored to his throne in triumph, and drew his queen and his children out of their sanctuary into the light again. That first ruin and recovery, years before the final fall, was the pattern in little of the whole story. The family cast down and raised up again by the turning of fortune's wheel. And the child who had been born in the sanctuary in that first storm would die, all unknowing, in the second one. The sovereign came back as it happened, and won his throne again by hard fighting, and the prince born in sanctuary was carried out of his refuge into the splendor that was his birthright, the next king at last, the most precious child in all the kingdom. As he came up, this longed-for son was given his own princely establishment, sent away from the nursery of his sisters to be raised as a future king should be raised, in a strong castle on the edge of Wales where he kept his own court and was schooled in the arts of kingship. There, under the care of his mother's family, who governed his household and his education, the young prince was reared at a distance from his parents, as royal heirs often were, surrounded by tutors and officers and the ceremony due to the future king, learning his letters and his manners and the grave business of the kingship that awaited him. He was, by the accounts that survive, a promising and a studious boy, well taught and well mannered, the very picture of a young prince being shaped for the throne. And all the while, his mother's kindred gathered close about him, governing his court and guiding his upbringing, so that the boy grew up among the Queen's own family, bound to them by affection and dependence, a circumstance that would prove, when the storm broke, to be the undoing of them all. The castle in the west, where the young heir kept his court, deserves a closer look, for it was there that the boy who was to be king spent the most of his short life, and the manner of his upbringing there bears upon all that followed. It was a strong fortress on the marches of Wales, in the wild border country, where England met the Welsh hills, and it had long been a seat of his father's house. And there the boy prince was established, while still a small child, with his own household and his own council, to learn the arts of rule and to govern, in his father's name, that turbulent border country. It was the custom for the heir to the throne to be given such an establishment of his own, a princely court in miniature, where he might be reared as a ruler among rulers and learn by doing the business of government. And so the young prince held his little court in the western castle, surrounded by his officers and his tutors, and the men appointed to guide his youth. First among those who governed the prince's household and shaped his upbringing were his mother's kindred, and this was a circumstance of the gravest moment for what came after. For the prince's governor, the man set over his household and his education, was the Queen's own brother on the maternal side, a brilliant and a cultivated nobleman among the most accomplished men of the age, and his half-brother too, her younger son by the first marriage, held a place close about him. So the heir to the throne was reared from his earliest years in the keeping of the Queen's kin, surrounded by her own people, bound to them by affection and habit and dependence, looking to them as his closest guardians and guides. It was natural enough and meant kindly, but it sealed the boy's fate, for it bound him inseparably to the hated Woodville family in the eyes of their enemies. And when the sovereign died and those enemies struck, the young king's closeness to that family made him a prize to be seized from them, and a pawn in the destruction of the brood that had reared him. The western castle and the upbringing it gave him in the keeping of the Queen's brother set the stage for the boy's undoing. The country in which the young prince was set up to keep his court, the rough marches between England and Wales, was one of the most unruly tracts of the realm. And the setting of the prince there was a matter of policy as much as of upbringing. For centuries that borderland had been a lawless and a violent country, a patchwork of lordships, where the king's writ ran weekly, where feuds and raids and disorder were the common condition of life, and where the marcher lords ruled their territories almost as petty kings. To govern such a land required a strong and a constant presence, and it had become the custom to set the heir to the throne, or a great prince of the blood, at the head of a council based in that wild country, to keep order in the monarch's name, and to hold the unruly region to its allegiance. So the young prince, while still a child, was made the nominal head of the government of that wild border, established with his council in a strong castle on those marches, the living emblem of royal authority, where it was sorely needed. He did not rule it himself, of course, being a child. The real work was done by the experienced men about him, his guardians and officers, who governed the marches in his name and used his princely name to overawe the turbulent lords and keep the peace. But it was good training for a coming king, this early association with the business of government, and it rooted the boy in a particular soil and a particular following, the borderers who served him. It was from that border soil, when his father died, that the boy sovereign set out upon his fatal journey toward the capital and his crowning. And it was the marcher men of his household, his mother's kindred chief among them, who escorted him on that road and were seized and destroyed along the way. The lawless march that had been his training ground became the starting point of his undoing, and the journey from the border to the capital was the journey from his princely childhood to his prison and his death. While the heir grew up in his castle in the west, the nursery at court gained another prince, a second son given to the monarch and queen some years after the first, a young brother for the prince, and another pillar for the throne. This second boy was made, while still a child, a duke of the highest rank, and married in a grand ceremony to an heiress of vast estates, a child bride of his own tender years, in one of those marriages of infants by which the mighty secured their fortunes. The boy duke and his child duchess joined in a grand wedding while both were scarcely out of the nursery. He ripened into a lively and a winning child, by the few accounts that reach us, the cherished second son of the house, the lesser boy beside his elder brother, the two boys together, the bright pledge of the dynasty's future. No one looking at those two boys, the prince in his western castle and the boy duke at court, could have dreamed how their story would end. The two of them shut up together in a grey fortress and vanishing from the sight of men. But that horror lay years ahead, and for now there were simply two princes of England, an heir and a brother, growing up in all the safety that a great throne could give. The marriage of the younger prince, while he was still a tiny child, wedded in a grand ceremony to a child bride, was no strange thing in that age, though it startles us now, and it is worth understanding the custom that lay behind it. Among the great of that time, marriages were matters of property and alliance, far more than of affection, and they were commonly arranged and even solemnized when the parties were mere children, sometimes infants barely able to walk, with the consummation of the union postponed for years until they came of age. The purpose of such cradle marriages was to secure a desired alliance, or above all, a desired inheritance, by binding the boys and girls together before any rival could intervene. And the wedding of a boy prince to a child heiress, however quaint it may seem, was a serious stroke of family policy, fixing the great wealth of the bride upon the husband's house. So it was with the younger prince, who was married, while still scarcely more than a babe in arms, to one of the greatest heiresses in the kingdom, a girl who carried with her one of the richest inheritances in the land. The two children were joined in a wedding of high splendour, a magnificent occasion of state, though the boy and girl together can scarcely have understood what was being done with them. And by that union, the vast estates of the girl were secured to the royal house, which was the whole purpose of the match. It was a brilliant stroke of policy, this marriage of infants, and it shows how early and how thoroughly the young ones of such a house were made, the instruments of their elders' designs, their very persons bestowed in marriage before they could speak, their futures mortgaged to the advantage of their house. The young bride, as it happened, did not live long, dying while both she and her boy husband were still children, so that the marriage came to nothing in the end. But it stands as a vivid emblem of the world these children inhabited, in which even a wedding might be the affair of infants, and the tiniest child was already a piece in the great game of property and power. Not all the little ones of the nursery lived to grow, for in that age the hand of death lay heavy upon the very young, and even the children of kings were not spared the common fate. Among the queen's brood were babes who came into the world and stayed only a brief while before they were carried off. Infants and babes who died as so many died in those years, of the fevers and sicknesses that no physician of the age could cure. There was a daughter who lived but a few brief months, and an infant son, made a duke in his cradle as royal boys and girls were, who died while still a boy. And these small graves, the babes who did not live, were part of the story of that nursery as much as the offspring who thrived. We should not pass over them, these lost children, for they were mourned as bitterly as any, and their early deaths were the first griefs of a family that would know so many. The queen, who bore 12 sons and infants, buried several of them in their infancy, as even the most fortunate mothers of that age so often had to do. And the splendour of her royalty was no shield at all against the oldest sorrow of motherhood. The little ones of the nursery who perished before they could grow were no strange thing in that age, for death walked very close to childhood in those years, and even the offspring of kings were not spared its constant presence. It is hard for us now to grasp how common a thing it was, in those times, for children to die. How many of the babies born into any family, however high or low, were carried off before they came to their growth, by the fevers and the fluxes and the sicknesses that the medicine of the age could neither understand nor cure. A mother of that time, even a queen, must expect to lose some of the children she bore, must steel herself to the likelihood that not all the little ones of her nursery would live, and the burying of an infant or a small child, grievous as it always was a sorrow that almost every family knew, woven into the very fabric of life in a way that we can hardly conceive. When such a loss fell, even upon a palace, it was met with the full and solemn mourning that the age reserved for its dead, the small coffin and the sung requiem and the prayers for a soul gone early to God. For the passing of a child of the blood was a matter of state, as well as of the heart, marked with ceremony, even as it was wept over in private. 3 of this nursery, by the count of the years, were taken in this way: an infant girl who breathed but a few months, a son honoured with a dukedom in his cradle, who slipped away while still a babe, and a maiden almost grown, poised upon the very edge of her wedding, who sickened and was gone before her womanhood could open. Each of these was mourned, we may be sure, with all the grief that any parent feels for a lost child, the more keenly, perhaps, for the bright hopes that had been placed upon them. And the queen, who bore so many children, had to give several of them back to the grave, as so many mothers of her age were forced to do. These early deaths were the first sorrows of a family that would know so many, the quiet griefs of the nursery before the great catastrophe came. And they remind us that even in its golden years, before the storm broke, the family had already known the touch of death and the breaking of a mother's heart. The last children of the nursery were daughters, 3 more girls in the later years of the marriage, who completed the wide family and who would, between them, see the strangest fortunes of all. The eldest of these later daughters came to womanhood and made a marriage of consequence, surviving into the new age that dawned after the clan's fall. The next was a girl who would likewise live and marry and carry the blood of her house forward into the line of mighty nobles. And the youngest of all her brood, the last daughter given to the king and queen, was destined for a quieter and a holier path, for she would give herself to religion and pass her life as a nun in a famous convent. Withdrawn from the world and its sorrows, praying out her days in the cloister, while her sisters lived the turbulent lives of noble ladies in the world. These 3 last daughters, the babies of the family, were children still when the catastrophe came that shattered their house, and they would grow up in the long shadow of it, the survivors of a ruined nursery, carrying into their later lives the memory of the bright early years and the terror that ended them. With these last daughters, the line was complete, 12 children in all across the years of the 2 marriages, the little ones of the night and the offspring of the king, a full nursery of sons and daughters at the very crown of the kingdom. And we have now to see them in their glory, before we follow them into their fall. It is worth pausing to distinguish the several sisters of this royal nursery, the daughters who lived and the princesses who died, for they were not a faceless company, but persons each with her own nature and her own fate. and they deserve to be known apart. The eldest, the firstborn, we have already met, the gentle and enduring girl who would rise at the last to a throne. But she had sisters who shared her childhood and her trials, each with her own story. There was the second daughter, a girl who grew toward womanhood only to be carried off by sickness before she could be married, dying in her early girlhood and leaving her family the first taste of the grief that would later overwhelm them. There was another sister who lived where that one died and came to be a woman, and played her part with dignity in the ceremonies of the court, and was married in due time and bore children and saw out a full span of years. And there were the younger sisters too, the babies of the family, who were small children when the catastrophe came and grew up in its long shadow. One of these was married, in the new age that followed, to a nobleman of high rank, and dwelt as a great lady, though sorrow followed her even there. For her husband fell under the suspicion of the wary new sovereign, and was for a time shut away, so that she knew, in her own marriage, something of the insecurity that had haunted her whole family. Another of the younger sisters gave herself to religion, and spent her life as a nun, the most sheltered of them all. Each of these sisters, the living and the dead, the wedded and the cloistered, carried in herself some part of the house's story, and together they make up the full company of the daughters of that house. The 7 sisters born to the king and queen, of whom 2 died young and 5 came to womanhood, and each of whom, in her own way, bore the burden and the blessing of her royal birth. They were individuals, these sisters, not merely a row of princesses, and the nursery they shared was the richer and the warmer for their several natures. For a few bright years before the darkness fell, the family stood at the very summit of its fortunes, and it is worth pausing to see them in their glory. For the height from which they were cast down makes the fall the more terrible. The father, the sovereign, had come through the storms of the civil wars, and reigned now in seeming security, his enemies beaten down, his throne restored after its brief eclipse, his realm at peace under his strong and genial hand. He was a magnificent king in those years, tall and splendid and open-handed, fond of pleasure and display, keeping one of the most brilliant courts in Christendom, and at the centre of all its splendour was his teeming family, his beautiful queen and his many children, the living proof of his dynasty's strength. The princes and princesses were growing up in a blaze of magnificence, clothed in silk and cloth of gold, attended by armies of servants, their every comfort and every honour provided as befitted the children of so mighty a monarch. To behold that family in its golden hour, the sovereign in his power, and the queen in her beauty, and the brood in their bright promise, was to see a house that seemed founded upon a rock, secured for generations, beyond the reach of any malice or misfortune. It was the calm before the storm, and none of them could feel the storm coming. The court over which the brood's father presided was one of the most splendid in all of Christendom, and it is a pleasant thing to dwell upon its splendour. For it was the glittering world in which the young ones passed their golden years. The monarch was a man who loved magnificence and understood its uses, and he made his court a marvel of richness and display, a place of feasting and pageantry and luxury that dazzled all who beheld it and proclaimed to the world the wealth and the grandeur of his restored throne. He drew much of his fashion from the brilliant court of Burgundy across the sea, then reckoned the most splendid in Europe, and imported its elaborate ceremony and its rich tastes, so that his own court blazed with cloth of gold and jewels, with sumptuous feasts and stately revels, with all the costly beauty that the age could contrive. The monarch himself, tall and handsome and gorgeously arrayed, was the very image of a magnificent prince, and his beautiful queen beside him, and their bright children about them, made of the royal family a living spectacle of grandeur. The life of such a court was a continual round of ceremony and display, of feasts and festivals and the solemn observance of the great days of the year, all conducted with an elaborate magnificence that we can scarcely imagine. There were the lavish feasts in the hall, the tables laden with rich and fantastical dishes, the gold and silver vessels, the minstrels and the entertainers. There were the tournaments and the hunts and the river pageants. There were the solemn ceremonies of state, the receiving of ambassadors, the keeping of the holy festivals, the whole stately theatre of monarchy. And the young ones moved through all of it, the princes and princesses of this gorgeous court, clothed in silk and velvet and cloth of gold, attended by their own servants, taking their appointed places in the ceremonies of their father's reign, growing up amid a splendour that was the wonder of the age. It was the high summer of their house, those years of magnificence, the brood at the very height of its fortune and its glory. And the boys and girls who grew up in that golden blaze could have had no inkling that it was all so soon to be swept away. And the splendour exchanged for sanctuary and the fortress and the block. At the centre of the children's golden years stood their father, the monarch, and he is worth a closer look, for he was the sun around which their bright world turned, and his strength was the thing that kept them safe while it lasted. He was a magnificent figure of a man, this father, very tall and very handsome, towering over other men, strong and active in his youth and famed for his beauty of person. And he had a warmth and an ease of manner that drew men to him, a genial, open, pleasure-loving temper that made him beloved where a colder king might only have been feared. He was a soldier of the first rank, who had won his crown in battle and never once lost a fight in all his wars, decisive and bold in the field. And yet in peace he was no stern warrior, but a lover of comfort and good cheer, of feasting and finery and the company of women, given to indulgence as his years went on, and his hard youth gave way to an easier prime. He was, in short, a man of large appetites and large abilities both, a ruler who could be terrible to his enemies, and yet was a fond and an indulgent father to his children. For he loved his children, this warm, genial king, and delighted in them, and made of his family the chief ornament and joy of his court. He had built that family with the wife he had married for love against all counsel, and he cherished both the wife and the children she gave him, lavishing upon them the wealth and the splendour of his restored throne. Under the shelter of his strength, the brood grew up safe and golden, secure in the protection of a father who was the mightiest man in the kingdom and who held all their foes in check by the sheer force of his presence. While he lived, no harm could come near them. His strength was their wall, his love their warmth, his throne their certain inheritance. It was only when that strength was suddenly withdrawn, when the strong king sickened and died in the very prime of his powers, that the boys and girls learned how much had rested upon their father alone, and how naked and exposed they were without him. For the wall came down with him, and all the enemies he had held back came flooding in upon his helpless children. The court in which these small ones grew up was not only a place of feasting and display, but also, in its way, a place of books and learning. For it was in their father's reign that a new and a wonderful art first came into the kingdom, the art of printing, which would change the world more deeply than any of the wars and crownings of that age. In those very years, a man of enterprise raised the first printing press the realm had ever seen in the precincts of the great abbey by the river, and began to turn out books by the new mechanical art, multiplying copies as no scribe could ever do, and putting the written word within reach of a wider public than ever before. It was a quiet revolution, little noticed perhaps amid the clash of the great events of the day, but more lasting in its effects than any of them, and it happened under the eye, and with the favour of their father and his court, who patronised the new art and welcomed its products. The Queen's own brother, The cultivated nobleman who governed the air at the Western Castle was one of the chief patrons of this new learning, a scholar and a translator who rendered worthy books out of other tongues. And one of his own translations was of the very first works to issue from that pioneering press. So the king's offspring grew up at a court that stood at the threshold of a new age of learning, where the old age of the handwritten book was giving way to the new age of the printed one, where the wisdom of the ancients and the devotions of the faithful were being multiplied and spread as never before. They were of the last royal boys and girls of the old order, and of the first to grow up in the dawn of the printed word. And though they themselves were swept away by the violence of their time, the quiet revolution that began at their father's court went on, outlasting all the quarrels of kings, spreading learning and changing minds long after the swords of that age had rusted away. There is a strange poignancy in it, that the same court and the same years that produced so much bloodshed also produced this gentle and enduring gift, and that the cultivated man who fostered it should himself have perished upon the block. The violence that engulfed the brood after their father's death was not the first time that deadly strife had broken out within their own family. For the father himself had a brother who came to a dark end years before, and that earlier tragedy casts a shadow forward upon the later one. This other brother of the ruler, another uncle of the brood, was a man of restless ambition and uncertain loyalty, who had more than once turned against the ruler, his brother, in the troubled years of the reign, joining the king's enemies, rising in revolt, and being more than once forgiven and taken back. But his treasons and his discontents at last exhausted even a brother's patience, and he was finally arrested, condemned for his offences, and made away with in secret within the walls of a fortress, undone by the very brother whose crown he had coveted. And so, years before the children's own catastrophe, the family had already shown that it could turn upon itself and shed its own blood. There is a grim foreshadowing in this earlier killing, this slaying of one royal brother by another, of the worse ruin that was to follow. The same deadly logic that led the father to put his own brother to death would lead, after the father was gone, to the surviving brother's seizing of the throne and the casting down of the young ones. The clan that had already devoured one of its own would devour its children too. It was a house in which the ties of blood gave no safety, in which brother might destroy brother and uncle might destroy nephew, in which the prize of the crown overrode every bond of kinship and affection, and the offspring grew up in such a house, heirs to its greatness and to its curse alike. The earlier killing of the one uncle was a warning, had anyone cared to mark it, of what the lust for the throne could do even within a single family. And when the father died and left his children exposed, that same lust, in the surviving uncle, would complete the ruin that the family's own violence had long ago foretold. The surest sign of the line's greatness was the dazzling marriages that were planned for the brood. For the hand of each prince and princess was a prize of high policy, and the sovereign bargained over his children's futures with the foremost powers of Europe. His eldest daughter was promised, by a solemn treaty with the old enemy across the sea, to the heir of the French crown himself, so that she was to be one day the Queen of France, the grandest match imaginable for an English princess. Another daughter was pledged to the royal house of Scotland to seal a peace upon the northern border, and yet another was sought in marriage by the mightiest princes of the continent, destined, as the plans then stood, to become the Duchess of one of the richest territories in Europe. Even the little second prince, scarcely out of his cradle, was married off to the greatest heiress in England, a child bride whose vast inheritance was thus secured to the royal house. These were the futures mapped out for the Queen's children in the bright years. Thrones and duchies and the grandest alliances in Christendom, the offspring of the upstart queen set to marry into the oldest and proudest houses of Europe. It was the measure of how high the family had climbed, that its offspring were sought by kings, and it made the ruin that followed when all these glittering plans dissolved into nothing. The more bitter, by contrast, the dazzling marriages that were planned for these boys and girls, the thrones and the duchies dangled before them, were the common stuff of royal diplomacy in that age, and it is worth understanding how such matches were made. For their hands were among the chief instruments of their father's statecraft. A royal child, almost from birth, was a piece upon the board of international politics. Its marriage a matter of the gravest bargaining between kings, to be bestowed where it would bring the greatest advantage in alliance or in territory or in peace. The betrothing of children, even of infants, was a commonplace, a solemn promise of a future marriage made between two royal houses for reasons of policy, binding the children to a union years before they were of an age to wed, sometimes before they could even speak. These betrothals were sealed with treaties and oaths and the exchange of great sums, and they were among the weightiest acts of diplomacy that a king could perform. The hand of a daughter pledged to a prince abroad could buy a peace or seal an alliance worth more than an army. But these grand betrothals were also as fragile as the policies that made them, and a match arranged with great ceremony, one year might be cast aside the next, when the shifting interests of kings no longer required it. So it was with the boys and girls of this royal house, whose dazzling betrothals dissolved one by one as fortunes changed. The eldest daughter, solemnly pledged to the heir of a foreign crown, saw that match repudiated when the alliance behind it collapsed, the foreign prince taking another bride and leaving her forsaken. The grand futures planned for this brood, the crowns and the duchies, were thus built upon sand, depending wholly upon the continuance of the policies and the alliances that had called them into being. And when the great catastrophe came and the house fell, all these glittering arrangements simply vanished, the foreign princes who had been offered the princesses of England turning away from a fallen and a ruined house. The marriages that were planned for the little ones in their golden years were the measure of their greatness while it lasted, but not one of those dazzling matches came to pass as it was planned. And the sovereign's offspring, who had been pledged to the heirs of Europe, came, in the end, to far humbler or far darker fates than their fathers had designed for them. The daily round of these royal children was one of ordered splendour and careful nurture, the setting of a great medieval court, and it shaped them as such a setting shapes its children. The princesses were raised in the queen's household, taught the accomplishments proper to great ladies, their reading and their music and their needlework, their dancing and their deportment, schooled above all in the grave and gracious manners that a princess must command. The heir was raised apart in his own princely establishment in the West, schooled in the harder arts of kingship, in letters and law and the bearing of a ruler, prepared from boyhood for the throne that awaited him. All of them lived amid a ceremony and a magnificence that never relaxed, surrounded by the officers and servants of their royal estate, their days ordered by the slow rituals of a court, their persons hedged about with the reverence due to the blood royal. It was a glittering childhood, but not perhaps a tender one by our lights, for young princes and princesses were often raised at a distance from their parents, in their own establishments, seeing their mother and father only on occasions of state. The love was there, by every sign, but it was a love expressed through magnificence and provision, rather than through the daily closeness that humbler families knew. Such was the existence of the Queen's brood in their golden years, a world of silk and ceremony and high expectation, and it was the only world they knew, until the day it was torn away. It is worth dwelling a little on the manner in which royal children such as these were reared, for it was a curious upbringing by our lights, full of magnificence and yet strangely lacking in the ordinary closeness of family, and it shaped the children who passed through it. A royal child, almost from the moment of birth, was surrounded by a whole household of servants, given wholly to its care, a small army of nurses and rockers and attendants who tended its every need, so that the child was never alone and never neglected and never, perhaps, quite private. The infant was given over first to a wet nurse, a woman chosen with great care to suckle the royal child, for the mother of such high rank seldom nursed her own children. And as the child grew, it passed into the charge of a governess and a train of attendants who oversaw its rearing under the distant authority of the parents. The whole upbringing was hedged about with ceremony and degree. The brood attended according to their rank, served on bended knee, raised always in the consciousness of the great blood they carried and the great destinies that awaited them. The education of this brood was careful and serious, suited to the stations they were being prepared to fill. The daughters were taught the accomplishments of noble ladies, to study their letters and perhaps to write, to ply the needle with skill, to sing and to play and to dance, to carry themselves with the grace and the dignity that a princess must show, and above all, to be devout and modest and obedient, for these were the virtues most prized in a high-born woman of the age. The heir to the throne was given a sterner and a fuller schooling, taught his letters in Latin and French, as well as English, instructed in the law and the history and the bearing of a king, trained in the manly arts of riding and arms and the chase, prepared in every way for the heavy burden of rule that he was born to carry. It was an upbringing designed to produce not happy children, but capable princes and gracious princesses, fit for the thrones and the great marriages that awaited them. And if it seems to us a cold and a formal sort of childhood, hedged with ceremony and often distant from the parents, it was the only childhood that royal children knew, and they knew it in its fullest splendour, in the golden years before their world came down. The lives of these royal children were lived out in their golden years, amid an endless round of ceremony and ritual, for the court of a medieval king was a stage of solemn observances, and the brood had their parts to play in the shining spectacle of monarchy. From their earliest years, they were schooled in the grave deportment that their station demanded, taught to carry themselves with dignity, to take their appointed places in the processions and the feasts and the solemn ceremonies of state, to be, in their small persons, ornaments and instruments of the royal magnificence. A royal christening, a royal wedding, the keeping of the high festivals of the year, the receiving of ambassadors, the coronations, and the funerals of the mighty, all were occasions of elaborate ceremony in which the young ones of the king took their honoured places, robed and jewelled and instructed in their roles, living symbols of the dynasty's continuance and splendour. It was a childhood lived very much in public, hedged about with observance, in which even the youngest children were figures of state, their every appearance an occasion, their persons treated with the reverence due to the blood royal. The princesses were carried or led in the great processions, dressed in cloth of gold, shown to the people as the precious daughters of the monarch. The little princes were shown to the realm as the pledges of its future, honoured with high titles and grand ceremonies while still in their cradles. It was a magnificent way to be reared, but a strangely impersonal one too, in which the child was always also a symbol, the private person forever merging into the public figure, the small boy or girl forever on display as a piece of the royal pageant. The brood knew no other way of living and took their ceremonial duties as naturally as humbler children take their play, and the grand rituals of their father's court were the very air they breathed, the framework of their golden years, until the day those years ended and the pageant gave way to the catastrophe. It is worth trying to picture the daily round of one of these royal daughters in her golden years, the texture of the days she led before the storm, for it was an existence of a peculiar richness and a peculiar enclosure both. From her waking the princess was surrounded by her women, the ladies and servants who dressed her and tended her and never left her side, robing her each morning in the rich stuffs that befitted her station, in fine wool and silk and velvet, in gowns trimmed with fur and threaded with gold, for even a child of the blood royal was clothed as a walking emblem of her father's wealth. Her days were ordered and unhurried, divided between her devotions and her lessons and her needle, between the chapel where she heard mass each morning, and the chamber where she conned her letters and plied her embroidery, and learned the music and the dancing that a lady must know. She ate of the finest the kingdom could provide, served in state upon vessels of silver, the rich dishes of a royal table set before a child who had never known hunger, and she slept in hangings of embroidered cloth, warmed by fires that others tended, watched over, even in her sleep, by the attendants of her estate. Yet, for all its richness, it was an enclosed and a guarded existence, lived almost wholly within the women's apartments of the palace, hedged about with ceremony and watchfulness. For a princess was a precious thing whose honour and whose person must be kept safe at every moment against the dangers of a treacherous age. She seldom went beyond the walls of her enclosed sphere, except in state, surrounded by her guards and her women. Her companions were chosen for her hours ordered for her every step attended, and the chief business of her life, the marriage that would one day be made for her, was decided by others, in councils she never saw, in bargains struck over her head among kings. It was a gilded round, comfortable and honoured beyond the dreams of common folk, but it was not a free one. The princess was the most cherished of prisoners, kept in silk and waited on by many hands, but bound nonetheless by the iron rules of her station, her whole being shaped toward the single end of a great marriage and the bearing of royal children. Such was the daily round of the Queen's daughters in their bright years, rich and ordered and enclosed, until the day the order broke and the gilded world fell open into terror. Before we follow these little ones into their scattering, it is worth holding them a moment all together, as they were in their golden years, a whole company of brothers and sisters sharing one nursery and one childhood. For they were a brood before they were a tragedy, and the bonds among them were real. They were many, these boys and girls, spread across a range of years, so that the eldest were growing toward marriage, while the youngest were still in the cradle, and the elder sisters must often have served as second mothers to the little ones, helping to tend and mind the babies of the family as elder sisters do. With so many siblings, there were surely the ordinary bonds and frictions of any large family, the elder ones and the younger, the closeness of those near in age, the small alliances and rivalries of the nursery, all played out against the unimaginable splendour of their royal setting. We catch only glimpses of these bonds across the centuries, for the records tell us little of the private affections of such royal young. But we know that the eldest sister was close to her brothers and sisters, that the two princes at the end had only each other, that the surviving sisters kept ties of affection into their later years. They were a family, in short, for all their grandeur, children who shared meals and lessons and games and the long ceremonies of their father's court, who understood one another as only siblings can, who had, in those early years, the simple warmth of belonging to one another. It makes their fate the more poignant that they were not merely royal pawns, but a family of siblings bound by blood and affection, and that the catastrophe which fell upon them was the tearing apart of that family, the scattering of brothers and sisters who had shared a nursery, the sundering of bonds that should have lasted all their lives. When we think of what was done to them, let us think of them first as they were in their warm years, a company of siblings who belonged together, for it was that belonging, as much as their crowns and their titles, that the cruelty of their age destroyed. The lives of these royal sons and daughters, like the lives of all the people of that age, were framed and ordered by religion to a degree that we can scarcely imagine now, and their faith was the very air they drew, woven into each hour of the day. From their earliest years they were schooled in the devotions of the church, taught their prayers and their catechism, brought up to hear Mass each morning and to keep the fasts and the feasts of the holy calendar, surrounded always by the rituals and the consolations of religion. The day of a royal child was punctuated by its devotions, opening and ending with prayer, marked by the hearing of Mass and the saying of the offices, and the festivals of the church. The high holy days of the year were the chief landmarks of their calendar, kept with solemn ceremony and joyful observance. Religion was not a thing apart from their lives, but the frame of their whole existence, the lens through which they saw the world and their own place in it. This deep devotion of the age shaped the brood in ways both large and small, and it shows itself throughout their story. It was the sacredness of holy ground that gave the Queen her refuge in sanctuary, and the reverence of the age for the Church that made even her enemies hesitate to violate it. It was the piety of the Queen's cultivated brother, his pilgrimages and his hair shirt beneath his armour, that marked him as a model of devout nobility. It was the religious vocation of the youngest daughter that drew her into the cloister to pass her life in prayer. The whole house moved within a world saturated with faith, in which God and the saints and the life to come were as real and as present as the visible things around them, in which every turn of events was understood as the working of providence, and every sorrow borne in the hope of heaven. And perhaps it was that faith in the end that gave them what comfort they could find amid their sufferings, the belief that beyond all the cruelty and the loss of this world, there waited a justice and a peace that no usurper could touch. For a house that lost so much in this life had, at least, the consolations of the next, and the boys and girls who were so cruelly used could believe, as their age taught them, that they would find in heaven the peace and the safety that earth had so harshly denied them. The end of that bright world came with shocking suddenness, in the loss of the father who was its centre and its strength. The monarch, still in the prime of his strength, not yet past his early 40s, was taken ill without warning, of what malady no one could quite say, and within a few days, to the astonishment of his whole realm, he was dead. It was an end that no one had prepared for, the sudden removal of a king in his vigour, leaving his great design half finished and his throne to a child, for the heir, the eldest of the princes, was a boy of but 12 years, far too young to rule in his own right, and the loss of the strong father left the family suddenly exposed, the protecting hand withdrawn in an instant. While the sovereign lived, his power had held all the jealousies of the court in check, had kept the old hatreds sleeping and the ambitious in their place. With his passing, that restraining hand was gone, and all the suppressed rivalries and resentments of the realm were free to break loose at once. The little ones who had basked in their father's greatness were left, in the space of a few days, fatherless and exposed, their protector gone, their futures suddenly uncertain, and the whole brilliant edifice of their fortune left resting upon the slender shoulders of a boy of 12. It was the hinge upon which their whole story turned, the sudden loss of the ruler, and from it all the rest of their sorrows flowed. One of the most staggering things about the destruction of this family is the sheer speed of it. The way in which a house that had stood secure at the summit of the kingdom was utterly overthrown in the space of a few short weeks, so that the whole catastrophe, from first to last, was compressed into a single dreadful spring. When the father died, the clan stood at the height of its fortunes, the heir about to be crowned, the future seeming assured, and within little more than 2 months the heir had been seized and deposed, the queen and her daughters driven into sanctuary, the queen's brother and son carried off and beheaded, the younger prince surrendered from his refuge, the marriage of the parents declared void, and the children all made bastards, and the uncle crowned king in the place of the nephew he had supplanted. It was a reversal of fortune so swift and so complete that the mind can scarcely take it in. an entire world overturned between one season and the next, the work of years undone in a matter of weeks. There is a kind of horror in that swiftness, in the thought of how fast the secure can become the ruined, how little warning the family had, how suddenly the ground opened beneath them. One spring they were the first family of the realm, basking in the certainty of their greatness. Before that same spring was out, they were scattered and broken, some dead, some in sanctuary, all stripped of their rank and their hopes. The men who worked their ruin moved with a speed and a decision that left no time for resistance or recovery, striking blow after blow before the line could gather itself to answer, so that each fresh disaster fell before the last had been understood. It is a lesson, perhaps, in the fragility of all earthly greatness, that a family so high could be brought so low so fast. But more than a lesson, it is simply a horror. The spectacle of a whole house of children swept from the summit of fortune into ruin in the turning of a single season, faster than grief itself could keep pace. The boy who was now, of a sudden, the ruler, was far away when his father died, keeping his court in his castle in the west, and the manner in which he was brought toward his throne was the first act of the tragedy. For the dead king had a brother, a man who had served him loyally in life, and whom he had named, by his last wishes, to govern the realm and protect the young king during his minority. And this uncle, a capable and an ambitious man, now took the direction of affairs into his hands. The child king set out from his western castle toward the capital, to be crowned, escorted by his mother's kindred, the uncle and the half-brother who had governed his household and who were closest to him. But as the royal party journeyed toward London, the dead king's brother, the appointed protector, came upon them, and in a sudden stroke seized the person of the child king and arrested the kinsman who escorted him. It was done smoothly and without resistance, the protector professing only to be securing the king's person and removing evil counsellors from about him. But it was in truth the first move in the seizing of the throne, and the boy king passed in that hour from the keeping of his mother's family into the hands of the uncle who would supplant him. The queen, waiting in the capital for her son, heard the news with horror, for she understood at once what it meant, and in the dead of night she gathered her remaining children and fled, as she had fled once before, into the sanctuary of the great church, to begin the most desperate passage of her life. The peril that engulfed the children sprang in large part from a single hard fact, that their father died leaving a child to inherit. And it is worth understanding why a child upon the throne was so dangerous a thing in that age. A sovereign was meant to rule as well as to reign, to command his armies and govern his realm, and hold the great men of the kingdom in awe by the force of his own person. And a child could do none of these things. When a grown and a capable king died and left a boy to succeed him, the kingdom was plunged at once into a perilous interval, a time when the throne was filled, but the strength behind it was empty, when the realm must be governed in the child's name by other hands until he came of age. And that interval was a standing invitation to ambition and to faction. For whoever could seize the person of the boy sovereign and the direction of his government would wield the royal authority himself, and the great men of the realm would contend, sometimes to the death, for that glittering prize. The history of the kingdom held grim warnings of what a royal minority could bring, of the strife and the bloodshed that so often attended the reign of a child. As the proud family struggled for control of the sovereign and the authority that flowed from him. A boy king was a pawn in a deadly game, his person a prize to be fought over, his very name a banner under which ambitious men might cloak their own designs, and the safety of such a king depended wholly upon the loyalty and the restraint of the men around him, which, in that hard and grasping age, could never be relied upon. When the children's father died and left his throne to a boy of 12, he left his son in just such a position of peril, the helpless centre of a struggle for power that would tear the family apart. And the protector who was meant to guard the child instead seized him and used his grip on the child king as the first step towards seizing the throne itself. The minority that should have been a time of careful guardianship became instead the occasion of the house's destruction. For a child king was a temptation that the ambition of the age could not resist. A part of the reason the uncle was able to seize the throne so swiftly lay in the great strength he commanded in the upland reaches of the realm, and it is worth understanding that strength, for it was the foundation upon which his usurpation was raised. For many years before his brother's death, the uncle had governed the north of the realm in the sovereign's name, ruling those wild and distant provinces as a kind of viceroy. And in that long governance he had won a deep and a genuine loyalty among the lords and commons of the region. He had ruled them firmly, and by their account fairly defending the border against the old enemy beyond it, keeping order in a turbulent country, binding the northern gentry to himself by service and reward, and they loved him for it, and looked to him as their lord and champion, with a devotion that few other magnates of the realm could command. When his brother died, the uncle could draw upon that northern loyalty as upon a private army, summoning the hardened men of that country to his side. And it was their swords, in great part, that overawed the capital and secured his grip upon the throne. This regional strength of the uncles stood in sharp contrast to the position of the Queen's kin, who were creatures of the court and the south, without any such territorial might of their own to fall back upon. Her kindred had risen by royal favour and advantageous marriage, not by the slow building of a loyal following in some province of the realm. Their strength was a thing of office and influence, dependent wholly upon their nearness to the crown. And when that nearness was struck away by the king's death, they had little solid strength to set against the uncle's northern host. It was a fatal weakness in their position, this lack of a base of their own, and it helps to explain how swiftly and how completely they were overthrown. For against the uncle, with his faithful borderers at his back, the courtier kin of the Queen, for all their wealth and titles, could muster no force that could stand. The north was the uncle's fortress and his army both, and it carried him to the throne over the bodies of her defenceless family. The boy at the centre of all this storm, the young king who was seized and deposed and shut away, deserves to be remembered as a person and not merely as a victim. For by all the accounts that reach us, he was a child of real promise, and the world lost something when it lost him. He had been reared with the greatest care for the throne he was born to fill, schooled from his infancy in his western castle in all the learning and the bearing that a king should have. And the reports that survive speak of him as a boy grave, and accomplished beyond his years, learned and well-spoken, devout and serious, already marked with the dignity of the station he was being prepared to assume. He was, it seems, no ordinary child, but one of unusual gifts, in whom his teachers and his guardians had taken great pains, and who might, had he been allowed to grow and to reign, have made a worthy and a cultivated king. That such promise should have been snuffed out, that this carefully nurtured boy should have been seized on the very threshold of his reign and shut away to perish in the dark, is one of the saddest wastes of all the wastes of that wasteful age. He came to the throne a boy of 12, full of the training and the hopes that had been lavished upon him, and he reigned, in name, for only a few brief weeks before he was set aside. A king who was never crowned, who never held the power that was his by right, who passed from the schoolroom almost directly to the prison. We do not know what he understood of his own undoing, this grave and clever boy, how much he saw of the plot that was closing around him, what he felt as the crown was withheld and the guards drew closer and his servants were sent away. But he was old enough, surely, to understand much of it, and there is a particular pity in the thought of that intelligent child watching his own destruction unfold and powerless to prevent it. The boy king who never reigned was one of the brightest of all the queen's children, and one of the most cruelly cut down. The sanctuary into which the queen fled with her brood was the same holy refuge that had sheltered her once before, in the earlier overturning of her fortunes. And now in her extremity, she claimed its protection again. Gathering her daughters and her one remaining son, the younger prince, about her in the dead of night, she hurried them into the precincts of the great church and abbey by the river, where by ancient custom no hand might seize those who took refuge upon the holy ground. There, in cramped and cheerless lodgings within the sanctuary, the queen and her children huddled together in fear and uncertainty, cut off from the world. While outside the walls, the children's uncle tightened his grip upon the kingdom and the person of the young sovereign. It was a desperate and a pitiful situation. The once proud queen reduced to a hunted fugitive, clinging to the protection of the church. Her brood gathered fearful about her, her eldest son already in the hands of his enemies, and her own future utterly dark. The bright years were over now, and the family that had stood at the summit of the realm was scattered and broken, half of it in sanctuary and half of it in the power of the man who meant to take the throne. The ancient right of sanctuary, which alone now stood between the queen and the men who hunted her, is worth understanding in itself, for it was one of the strangest and most powerful customs of that deeply religious age. By the custom and the law of the medieval church, certain holy places, and above all certain great abbeys and minsters, gave protection so that a fugitive who reached the sanctuary and claimed its shelter could not be seized or harmed there without committing a grave sacrilege against God and religion. It was an old and a venerable institution, born of the reverence of a devout age for hallowed ground, and it gave to the hunted and the desperate a last hope of safety that even kings were loath to violate. For to drag a refugee from sanctuary by force was to outrage holy religion and to call down upon oneself the wrath of heaven and the censure of all the faithful. Among all the sanctuaries of the realm, the chief abbey by the river held one of the most famous and most inviolable, a refuge so hallowed that to breach it by force would have shocked all Christendom. And it was the strength of that custom alone, and no army or wall, that now kept a defenceless mother and her girls beyond the reach of the man who ruled the kingdom. Yet sanctuary, for all its sacredness, was a frail enough protection in the hands of a desperate and a determined enemy, as the queen was to learn. It could shelter her person and the persons of her young ones from open seizure, so long as the man who hunted them shrank from the sacrilege of violating consecrated ground. But it could not feed them, nor restore their fortunes, nor protect those who were already in his power, nor prevent him from working upon the queen by every art of persuasion and threat to give up what the sanctuary still sheltered. And so it proved, for the queen, safe herself upon the sacred ground, was yet worked upon until she gave up her younger son out of the sanctuary, persuaded that the boy would be safe, and that to keep him in refuge was unfitting. And once he was beyond the hallowed precinct, he was beyond all help. The sanctuary kept the queen and her daughters from seizure through all the terrible months of the usurpation, and in that it served its purpose. But it could not save the sons she had already lost, nor undo the ruin of her house, and it was in the end less a fortress than a jail, a refuge that was also a scene of helpless waiting, while the world she had known was torn apart outside its walls. The months that the queen and her daughters passed in their sanctuary were a long ordeal of fear and privation, and it is worth dwelling on what that confinement must have been. For it was the lowest pass of all their fortunes. They had fled into the refuge in haste and terror, snatching what they could carry, and there they remained shut up for the better part of a year, in cramped and comfortless lodgings within the precincts of the holy place, cut off from the world and from their friends, living on sufferance and charity while their enemies ruled outside. The queen who had reigned in palaces, who had kept one of the most splendid courts in Christendom, was reduced to a fugitive, huddled with her daughters in bare rooms, stripped of her state and her servants and her wealth, dependent for her very bread upon the grudging goodwill of those who let her stay. It was a fall as steep as any in that age of steep falls, from the height of queenship to the squalor of a refugee, and she endured it with her daughters about her through all the terrible months. And there was no comfort in those months, but only a deepening of sorrow, for it was during that confinement that the worst of her griefs came upon her. There, in the sanctuary, she was worked upon until she gave up her younger son, watching him, led away to join his brother in the fortress. There she received, we may suppose, the news of the deaths of her brother and her son upon the northern block. There, as the summer wore on, the rumours must have reached her that her two princes were seen no more, that they had vanished within the fortress, that she had lost them too. Shut in her refuge, helpless to act, she had to drink the cup of all these sorrows, one after another. The giving up of her boy, the killing of her kindred, the vanishing of her sons, with nothing to do but watch and pray and grieve. The sisters who shared her confinement, the 5 princesses huddled with their mother in the sanctuary, lived through it all beside her, sharing her fear and her grief and her privation. Growing up in those terrible months from sheltered princesses into the hardened survivors of a ruined house. When at last they came out of the refuge into an uncertain and a diminished freedom, they came out changed forever, marked by the bitter ordeal of the sanctuary as by a fire through which they had passed. The cruelest stroke of those sanctuary days was the giving up of the younger prince, the second son, whom the queen was at last persuaded, or compelled, to surrender out of her keeping. For the uncle and his counsellors pressed the queen hard to give up the boy, urging that the young king, his brother, was lonely and wanted his company, that it was unfitting for a prince to be shut up in sanctuary, that no harm in the world was meant to him, and the queen, isolated and frightened and out of allies, at last gave way, and let her boy be taken from her to join his brother. We may imagine the anguish of that parting, the mother surrendering her little boy to the men she had every reason to fear, watching him led away out of the one place where he was safe, for she would never see him again. And some part of her must have known, even as she let him go, that she was giving up her child to a fate she could not prevent. The 2 princes were now together, the boy sovereign and his brother, lodged in the royal apartments of the great tower by the river that served the kings of England, both as a palace and as a prison. And there, behind those mighty walls, the 2 children passed out of their family's keeping and into the keeping of the man who had supplanted them. The stronghold by the river, in which the 2 princes were lodged, and in which they vanished, was the most famous and the most dreaded stronghold in the kingdom, and it carried already, even then, something of the dark reputation that clings to it still. It had been raised long before by the first Norman conqueror of England, a mighty keep of pale stone set upon the bank of the river to guard and to overawe the capital. And in the centuries since it had grown into a great complex of towers and walls and courts, serving the kings of England in many capacities at once. It was first of all a royal residence, one of the chief seats of the crown, where kings kept their state and their treasure, and from which, by ancient custom, they rode out to their coronations. And so there was nothing sinister in itself, in the lodging of the young king within it before his crowning, for it was the natural and the proper setting for him to await that ceremony. But the same stronghold that was a dwelling was also a prison, the chief state jail of the kingdom, where the most dangerous enemies of the crown were held. And it was also an arsenal, a treasury, a place of execution, a fastness of grim and many uses. It was this double nature, at once a palace and a prison, that gave so sinister a colour to what befell the princes there. For the monarch's offspring, who entered its gates as a king and a prince awaiting a coronation, became, by imperceptible degrees, prisoners within its walls. At first their lodging there was natural and expected, the proper housing of the child king before his crowning. But as the uncle's design unfolded, and the crowning was set aside and the children were declared base-born, their stay there changed its character without any open change being made, the royal guests becoming, in all but name, captives. They were withdrawn deeper into the inner parts of the keep, seen less and less, guarded more closely, until the royal lodging had become a prison, and the princes its most helpless inmates. And somewhere within those grim towers, in the end, they met whatever fate was prepared for them. The stronghold by the river had housed many tragedies in its long history, and would house many more, but few so haunting as this: the two royal children who passed through its gates and never came out. And it is their fate above all that has fixed the dark name of the place in the memory of after ages. There is something that catches at the heart in the thought of the two princes together in their last days. The elder brother and the younger, shut up in the fortress, with only one another for company as the world they had known fell away around them. They were unlike these two boys, by what little we know of them. The elder, the boy who had been king, was a grave and a studious child, old beyond his years, schooled from infancy for the throne, and marked already with the seriousness of one bred to rule. The younger was a livelier and a merrier child, by the few accounts that survive, the cherished second son who had been spared the heavy training of the heir. The one had been reared apart in his western castle, learning the burden of kingship. The other had stayed in the warmth of the brood at court, and they can have known one another in their early years only at a distance. The heir and his little brother meeting, but seldom, and then, at the very end, when everything else was taken from them, the two brothers were given to one another, shut up together in the fortress, the only two of all their scattered family left side by side. We may imagine them there in the failing months, the elder boy trying perhaps to comfort and protect the younger. The two of them drawing close in their fear and their bewilderment as the visits grew rarer and the guards more watchful and the hope of rescue dimmed. They had lost their father, their mother was shut away in sanctuary, their elder half-brother and their uncle had been carried off to death, and they had no one left in all the world but one another, two boys of 12 and 10, waiting together in the dark for a fate they could not understand. Whatever befell them in the end, they faced it together, the two brothers, and there is a small and a terrible comfort in that neither of them at the last was quite alone. They had been strangers almost in their golden years, the heir in his castle and the child at court, and they were made brothers in earnest only in their ruin, and died, it may be, in one another's company, the last and the most pitiful of all the partings of that broken family. What followed was the unmaking of the brood, the stripping from them of their very birthright, by a stroke as clever as it was cruel. For the uncle, who had by now resolved to take the throne himself, put it about that the marriage of the dead king and the queen had never been lawful at all, that the monarch had been secretly pledged to another woman before he ever wed the queen, so that the marriage was no marriage and the boys and girls of it were no true heirs, but bastards, barred from the throne by the stain of their illegitimacy. It was a charge impossible to disprove, however little anyone believed it, and it served its purpose to perfection, for upon this pretext the boys and girls of the marriage were declared base-born, stripped of their royal rights, set aside from the succession as though they had never been princes at all. The boy who had been king was king no longer, the princesses were princesses no longer. At a stroke of the pen, the whole brood was unmade. Cast down from the blood royal into bastardy, their father's crown declared to have passed them by. And the uncle, having thus cleared the young ones from his path, took the crown himself, was proclaimed and crowned king in the place of the nephew he had supplanted. The protector become the sovereign. The throne secured upon the ruin of the offspring he had been sworn to protect. The man who destroyed these small ones, the uncle who cast them down and seized their throne, is one of the most debated figures in all of English history. And it is worth pausing upon him, for the judgment of him has swung back and forth across the centuries and is disputed still. He was the youngest brother of the dead king, a man who had served the late sovereign with conspicuous loyalty through all the years of his reign. A capable soldier and administrator who had governed the north of the kingdom faithfully and well, and had given, until that fatal hour, no sign of the ambition that was to undo him and the children both. When his brother died and left a child to inherit, this uncle was the natural man to govern the realm in the boy's minority, and was so appointed, and what moved him from that position of trust? To seize the throne for himself and to destroy his brother's children is the great question that has never been settled. Some have seen in him a monster of ambition, a calculating villain who had planned the usurpation from the first and waded to the throne through the blood of his own kin. Others have seen a man driven to desperate measures by fear and the deadly logic of the times, persuading himself that he acted rightly, or at least necessarily, in a situation where to fail to seize power might be to perish. For the age in which these things happened was a brutal one, in which the losers in the Game of Thrones commonly paid with their lives, and a man who found himself protector of a boy sovereign, surrounded by a hostile and a powerful family, might well calculate that his own survival required him to strike first. Whether the uncle was a cold villain or a frightened man making terrible choices, or something of both, we cannot now say with certainty. For the records are partial, and the truth is buried under centuries of partisan telling, the blackening of his memory by the victors who supplanted him, and the later defending of it by those who think him wronged. What is certain is the outcome, whatever the motive, that the children were cast down and the two princes destroyed and the throne seized, and whatever moved the uncle, the ruin of his brother's children stands against his name, the central and the damning fact of his brief and troubled reign. He would wear the crown he had seized for but 2 years before he lost it, and his life with it, upon a battlefield. And history has never decided whether to pity him or to execrate him. The loyal brother turned usurper, the protector turned destroyer, the most haunted and disputed of all the kings of his line. The stroke by which the boys and girls were unmade, the declaring of them base-born, struck at something that the men of that age held sacred above almost all else, the idea of true-born descent, and it is worth understanding why that charge was so potent and so wounding. In the reckoning of the medieval world, everything depended upon legitimacy, upon being born of a true and a wedded marriage, for only a child of lawful birth could inherit its father's lands and titles, and only such a child could stand in the line of succession to a throne. A child conceived outside wedlock, however royal its blood, was barred by that single defect from all inheritance, set apart from the succession as though a wall had been raised between it and its birthright. And this was no mere technicality, but a principle woven into the deepest fabric of the age, upheld by the church and the law and the settled conviction of the time. To be declared base-born was therefore to be stripped of everything at a stroke. Cast out from the line of one's forebears, denied the very name and station into which one had been born. What gave the stroke its peculiar cruelty was the way it turned the age's own deepest principle against the innocent. For the very rule that should have guaranteed these young people their inheritance was the rule now twisted to strip it from them. The supposed earlier promise could be neither proved nor disproved at such a distance of time, and that was precisely its usefulness. It did not need to convince anyone, only to be solemnly asserted with the forms of law and ratified by a cowed assembly, and the thing was accomplished. An accusation that no living soul could test became, by mere proclamation and enforcement, the legal ground on which a sovereign's heirs were thrust out of their birthright. It was as cynical a use of a sacred thing as that hard age ever produced. The reverence for true descent bent into a weapon, a bare grasp at power dressed in the borrowed robes of legality, and when the forms had all been observed and the parchment sealed, the young people stood disinherited, not by the sword, but by a falsehood wearing the mask of justice, their whole estate undone with a stroke of the pen. The seizing of the throne by the uncle was made possible in part by the help of another mighty nobleman, a peer of the highest rank who threw his weight behind the usurpation at the crucial hour, and whose strange career bears upon the brood's story in more ways than one. This duke was among the foremost peers of the realm, a man of royal descent and vast estates, and his support was of the first importance to the protector in those critical weeks, for he lent his power and his prestige to the seizing of the boy king and the casting down of the queen's kin. For a time this lord and the protector worked hand in glove, richly rewarded for his help, raised even higher in wealth and office, the chief partner in the usurpation. And it seemed that he had bound his fortunes wholly to the man he had helped to the throne. But within a few months of the usurpation, this same lord turned against the master he had made and raised a wide rebellion against him, in one of the most puzzling reversals of that whole tangled time. What moved him to it has never been certainly known, whether disappointed ambition or horror at the fate of the princes or some deeper design of his own upon the throne. But he rose in arms against the master he had served, in concert with the scattered friends of the fallen family and the partisans of the exile abroad. The rebellion was ill-timed and ill-starred, broken by foul weather and mischance before it could gather its full strength, and he was taken and put to death for his treason, his proud revolt collapsing into ruin. Yet his rising, though it failed, was a sign of how quickly the usurper's support was crumbling. How many were turning against the man who had seized the throne, and it was bound up with the same conspiracy, the secret design of the two mothers to bring in the exile and marry him to the fallen queen's daughter, that would in the end prove the uncle's undoing. His strange treason was the first crack in the usurper's power, the beginning of the unravelling that would carry the brood's cause, against all odds, toward its eventual triumph. While the queen and her daughters sat helpless in their sanctuary, and the two boys lay shut in the fortress, the first blood of the family was shed, far away in a northern castle. For her brother and her second son, the kinsman who had escorted the young king and been seized upon the road, had been carried off as prisoners to the north. And now, as the uncle made himself king, the order went out for their deaths, without any proper trial, condemned by the bare will of the man who had seized them. These kinsmen of the queen were led out and beheaded in the yard of a northern castle, put to death for no crime but their loyalty to the young sovereign and their nearness to the queen's hated family. Her second son, the half-brother of the royal young ones who had been given a place in the boy king's household, perished thus upon the block, one of the first to pay with his life for belonging to the wrong family. And with him died her brother, the children's uncle on their mother's side, a brilliant and a cultivated man cut down for the crime of his blood. The news of these deaths, when it reached the queen in her sanctuary, must have fallen upon her like a hammer blow, the first killing of her own, the proof that her enemies would stop at nothing, the foretaste of a grief still worse to come. The queen's brother, who was beheaded in the northern castle, the uncle who had governed the boy sovereign at Ludlow, deserves to be remembered for more than the manner of his end. For he was one of the most accomplished and cultivated men of his time, and his murder was a waste as well as a crime. He was a nobleman of many parts, this brother of the queen, a renowned jouster and soldier who had shone in the tournaments that were the glory of his brother-in-law's court, and at the same time a man of deep piety and real learning, given to pilgrimage and devotion, who wore, it was said, a hair shirt beneath his splendid armour. He was a scholar and a writer too, who translated worthy books out of the French for the instruction of his countrymen, and he holds an honoured place in the history of his country. For he was the patron and the friend of him who first brought the new art of printing into England, and a book of his own translating was one of the very first to be printed upon English soil. He was, in short, a man of rare gifts and rare cultivation, a flower of the chivalry and the learning of his age, the very pattern of the accomplished nobleman. That such a man should have been led out and beheaded without trial, upon no charge but his kinship to the Queen and his nearness to the young king, is one of the small particular tragedies folded within the larger tragedy of the family's fall. He had been given the care of the child king, had governed his household and guided his education at the Western Castle, and had been, by every sign, a faithful and a loving guardian to the boy. And it was precisely this trust, this nearness to the heir, that doomed him when the uncle struck, for he stood between the protector and the boy he meant to control, and so he had to be removed. They took him as he escorted the young king toward the capital, carried him off to a northern stronghold, and there, when the time came to seize the throne outright, they put him to death, this gifted and pious and cultivated man, with no more form of justice than the bare command of the man who wanted him dead. He is remembered now, when he is remembered, as one of the victims of that terrible season, the Queen's brother who died upon the block. But he was a great deal more than a victim, and his death robbed his age of one of its finest men. The blood that was shed in the seizing of the throne was not only the blood of the Queen's kindred, for one of the dead king's closest friends, a high noble who had served him faithfully all his life, was struck down in those same weeks, with a suddenness that horrified all who heard of it. He had been the dead king's boon companion and chamberlain, one of the most trusted men of the old reign, and in the first days of the crisis he had actually sided with the uncle against the Queen's family, sharing the common jealousy of the upstart kindred and helping to clear them from the young sovereign's side. But there were limits to what this loyal man would countenance, and when it became clear that the uncle meant not merely to crush her kin, but to seize the throne itself and thrust aside the boys and girls of the master he had loved, he drew back and would go no further down that dark road. His hesitation was his death warrant, for the protector, who could not afford to leave so strong and so well-liked a man in opposition, resolved to be rid of him before he could become a focus of resistance. At a sitting of the council within the fortress, with no warning and no trial, the protector suddenly denounced the lord as a traitor, and had him seized then and there, and hurried out to instant execution. Struck down within the hour upon a block hastily made ready, without so much as the form of a hearing. It was a brutal and a lawless killing, the slaying of a loyal man upon a bare accusation, and it sent a wave of terror through the whole nobility, for if so high and so trusted a lord could be destroyed in an hour upon the uncle's word, then no one was safe. The death of this faithful chamberlain, struck down for the crime of loyalty to the dead sovereign's young sons, was one of the darkest deeds of that dark season, and it showed how far the man was prepared to go, and how little law or custom or old friendship would weigh against his drive toward the throne. With that killing and the beheading of the Queen's kindred in the same days, the way to the crown was cleared of every man who might have stood in its path. For the worst was still to come, and it came in silence, in the slow and dreadful fading of the two princes from the sight of men. Through the early summer, the two children had been seen at times within the grounds of the great tower, shooting and playing as boys will, glimpsed by those who passed. But as the weeks went on, they were seen more rarely, and then more rarely still, withdrawn deeper into the inner apartments of the place, shown to the world less and less, until at last they were not seen at all. No announcement was ever made, no death proclaimed, no funeral held. The two princes simply ceased to appear, fading from view as quietly as a candle gutters out, and the silence that closed over them was never afterward broken. What became of them behind those walls, no one has ever known for certain, then or since. But the belief took hold, and has never been dislodged, that the two princes were murdered there in the dark, mothered or made away with by the order of the man who had taken their throne and could not feel safe while they lived. The princes in the tower, the child king and his brother, vanished from history in the summer of their ruin, and left behind them only the most haunting mystery of that whole haunted age. The question that has never been answered, of how and when and by whose hand the two royal children met their end. The fate of the two princes who vanished into the fortress is the greatest unsolved mystery of that whole age, and it has never ceased to fascinate and to trouble the generations that came after. For the truth of it was hidden at the time, and has never since been certainly recovered. That the boys disappeared is beyond doubt. That they were almost certainly dead, within a year of their disappearance, is the settled belief of most who have studied the question. But how they died, and by whose order, and when exactly, and what became of their bodies, are questions that have been argued for centuries without ever reaching a sure answer. The common and the longest held belief has been that they were murdered by the order of the uncle who had seized their throne, smothered in their beds, in the dark of the fortress, because he could not feel secure while they lived. And there is much to be said for this dark verdict, for the boys were in his power, and their death served his interest, and no other explanation accounts so simply for their silent disappearance. Yet the matter has never been quite settled, and other hands have been suspected, and other tales have been told. Some have wondered whether another of the great men of that treacherous time, and not the uncle, contrived their deaths for his own ends. A few have even cast suspicion upon the man who came after and supplanted the uncle in his turn, suggesting that the princes might have outlived the uncle's reign and been made away with by the next master of the kingdom. And there were those, in the years that followed, who would not believe the boys dead at all, who clung to the hope that one of the pair had somehow escaped the fortress and lived, and that hope gave rise, in the next reign, to a famous pretender who claimed to be the younger of the two princes, grown to manhood, come back to claim his own, and who troubled the peace of the kingdom for years before he was at last unmasked and destroyed. Long afterward, in a later age, the bones of two children were found beneath a stair within the fortress, and were taken to be the bones of the lost princes and laid to rest with honour beside the tombs of the kings. But even those bones have never been certainly proven to be theirs, and the mystery endures, the most haunting of all the riddles of that haunted time, the two young princes who vanished into the dark and never came again. The shadow of the vanished princes did not pass away with the princes themselves, for in the years after their disappearance, the uncertainty of their fate gave rise to a strange and a troubling afterlife, in which men appeared, claiming to be one of the lost boys come back from the dead to claim his own. So long as no bodies had been found and no deaths proclaimed, the door stood open to doubt. And into that doubt stepped impostors, and the men who used them, for a living prince of the old line, was a weapon of terrible power against the new king who had taken the throne. The most famous of these claimants was a young man who appeared some years afterward, well-schooled and plausible, who gave himself out to be the younger of the two princes, the little duke, escaped somehow from the fortress and grown to a man abroad. And he was taken up by the enemies of the new monarch, and backed by foreign powers who wished the new ruler ill, and for years he troubled the peace of the kingdom. A phantom of the murdered boy raised up to haunt the man suspected of his death. This pretender pressed his claim with arms and with intrigue, gathered support at home and abroad, and put the new king to no little trouble and expense before he was at last taken and unmasked and put to death. And whether he believed his own tale, or was the knowing instrument of others, has never been certainly known. But his whole career, and the credit he found in many quarters, shows how deep and how lasting was the uncertainty that hung over the fate of the princes, how readily men could believe, or wish to believe, that one of the lost boys had survived. For the vanishing had been so silent, the ending so unproven, that the hope or the fear of a living prince could not be laid to rest. The pretenders who rose in the prince's name were the strange far shadow of the great mystery, the proof that the two boys, even in their disappearance, retained a fearful power over the fancy of their age. And the trouble they gave to the new ruler was a kind of posthumous vengeance, the lost princes reaching out of their unknown graves to trouble the peace of the kingdom that had let them die. It is hard, even across the centuries, to take the measure of that horror, the quiet disappearance of two boys, a child king of 12 and his young brother, swallowed up behind the walls of a fortress and lost to sight. They had been the brightest hopes of their house, the heir and the spare, the two princes upon whom the future of a dynasty had rested, and they were snuffed out in silence. Without trial or charge or even the cold honesty of an open execution, made to vanish as though they had never been. Somewhere within those grim walls, in the summer of that terrible year, the two children died, or were killed, or were spirited away to some unknown fate. And their mother, shut in her sanctuary not far off, was left to imagine the worst and to mourn the sons she could not save, not even knowing for certain whether they lived or died. Of all the sorrows that fell upon that broken family, this was the deepest and the darkest, the loss of the two young princes, and it has never ceased to trouble the conscience of the centuries, the image of those two children, the queen's lost sons, fading into the shadows of the fortress and out of the world. For a long while after the catastrophe, the surviving sisters lived in the shadow of their family's ruin, stripped of their royal rank, their brothers lost, their mother disgraced, their bright futures dissolved into nothing. In time, the queen and her daughters came out of their sanctuary, for they could not stay there forever, and the new king, having secured his throne, swore solemn oaths for their safety and drew them out into the world again. The girls received at the court of the very man who had supplanted and very likely murdered their brothers. It was a strange and a bitter position for the young women to live as guests, half honoured and half captive, at the court of their family's destroyer, their status uncertain, their hopes in ruins, dependent upon the goodwill of the usurper for their very keep. The eldest of them in particular, the firstborn princess, found herself in a position of peculiar delicacy, a young woman of marriageable age and royal blood, her hand a piece of high value even in her kin's disgrace. Courted and watched and bargained over in the shadowy politics of the usurper's court. The daughters of the queen had fallen far from the glittering futures once mapped out for them, the thrones and the duchies and the grand alliances. They were the cast-down survivors of a broken house, living on sufferance in a hostile world, waiting to see what fortune would yet do with them. Even in the depths of her ruin, shut in her sanctuary with her daughters and stripped of all her power, the fallen queen did not cease to strive for her children, and the clearest proof of her spirit was the secret design she wove, out of the very pit of her misfortune, to lift her eldest daughter to a throne. For while she sat helpless in her refuge, the queen entered into a secret correspondence with another woman, the mother of the banished claimant of the rival house, a shrewd and a determined lady who was scheming, from her own quarter, to win the throne for her exiled son. The two mothers, from opposite sides of the old quarrel, found that their interests had come strangely together, for each had a child whose fortunes might be made by a single bold stroke, and through trusted go-betweens they laid their plot, agreeing that if the exiled claimant could win the crown, he should marry the fallen queen's eldest daughter, joining their two houses and their two causes in one. It was a design of extraordinary daring, hatched in secret by two mothers in the teeth of the man who held the throne, and it would in the end remake the kingdom. There is something deeply impressive in this, that the fallen queen, robbed of everything, her sons lost and her power gone, should yet have found the spirit and the cunning to weave from her sanctuary a plot that would overturn the usurper and set her own daughter upon the throne. She had no armies, no wealth, no freedom even. She had only her wits and her will, and her fierce determination to salvage something for her brood out of the wreck of her house. And with these alone, she set in motion the train of events that would bring the usurper down. The plot the two mothers laid bore fruit at last upon the field of battle, when the banished claimant won his crown and kept his bargain and married the queen's daughter. And so it was that the fallen queen, out of the very depths of her ruin, became the architect of her family's restoration, the grandmother of the line of kings that followed. Whatever her faults, and her enemies charged her with many, no one could deny the fierce maternal courage of a woman who, with nothing left but her wits, schemed in her sanctuary to make her daughter a queen, and succeeded. The other woman, with whom the fallen queen wove her great design, the mother of the exiled claimant, deserves to be known in her own right, for she was one of the most striking figures of that whole age, and without her, the family's deliverance could never have come. She was a lady of royal descent, herself, sprung from a junior branch of the old royal line, and through her ran the claim to the throne that her exiled son would one day make good. Small of stature and frail of body, she was yet a woman of iron will and deep cunning and unshakable devotion to the cause of her only child. Through years she had laboured, through every shift of fortune, to advance and protect her son, marrying shrewdly to gain powerful protectors, biding her time through the weary years of his exile, never abandoning the hope that she might one day see him a monarch. She was famously devout, given to deep hours of prayer and rigorous religion, and famously clever. A woman of learning and policy who could match the craftiest men of her age at their own game. What this devout and iron-willed lady brought to the cause was not arms or treasure, of which she had little to spare, but something rarer in so treacherous a season, a wide net of trusted friends, a gift for patient and secret dealing, and an utter refusal to despair of a venture that seemed all but lost. Through her physicians and her quiet messengers, she carried word where no open embassy could pass, knitting together the scattered foes of the man on the throne and holding the fragile conspiracy together by sheer force of will through all its perils and delays. Without that tenacity, the design might have died a dozen times in the dark months of its making. It was she, as much as anyone, who kept the flame alive until the hour came to act. The deliverance of the Queen's brood, when it came, was in great part the work of these two mothers. The one who had lost so many of her children, striving to save the one she had left, and the other who had but a single child and would stop at nothing to make him a king. There is a passage in the story of the fallen queen that has puzzled and troubled those who have studied it, and that is worth pausing on, for it shows how terrible were the choices forced upon her, namely, her reconciliation with the very man who had destroyed her sons. After many months shut in her sanctuary, the queen at last came to terms with the usurper and agreed to leave her refuge and to send her daughters out into his keeping, into the court of the man who had seized the throne, as most believed, made away with her two boys. To our eyes there is something almost unbearable in the thought. a mother treating with the murderer of her offspring, placing her surviving daughters in his hands, accepting his oaths and his protection. And men have wondered ever since how she could have brought herself to it. But we must remember the desperation of her case, the utter helplessness to which she was reduced, before we judge her too harshly for that grim accommodation. She could not stay in sanctuary forever, with her daughters growing up imprisoned in a refuge, their lives passing and their prospects dwindling. She had no army, no power, no friend strong enough to restore her by force. And the man who held the throne had sworn solemn public oaths for the safety and the honour of her daughters, which she could not lightly refuse without condemning the girls to a perpetual captivity. Perhaps, too, she clung to some hope or some doubt about the fate of her sons, some shred of uncertainty in the absence of any proof of their deaths. Perhaps she calculated that more might be gained for her daughters by accommodation than by defiance. Perhaps she was simply worn down, after so many blows, to the point where survival was all that remained to strive for. Whatever her reasons, she made her peace with the usurper and came out of her sanctuary and let her daughters go to his court. And if it was a bitter and a compromising bargain, it was the bargain of a woman who had lost almost everything and was fighting, with the only weapons left to her, to save what little remained. But the wheel of fortune, which had cast the clan down, was preparing now to turn again, and from across the sea a deliverance was coming that no one could have foreseen. For the usurper's seizure of the throne had not gone unchallenged, and there remained in exile abroad a last claimant of the rival royal line, a young man who gathered to himself all the enemies of the man who now wore the crown. A secret bargain had been struck, in the dark days after the princes vanished, between the mother of this exiled claimant and the fallen queen. An agreement that if the exile could win the throne, he would marry the eldest daughter of the queen. Joining the two warring houses in his own marriage and uniting their claims, and upon this promise the friends of both lines made common cause against the usurper. The exiled claimant landed at last with a small force, gathered support as he marched, and met the usurper in a great battle that would decide the fate of the kingdom. And there, upon the field, the man who had taken the throne and destroyed the queen's children was himself struck down and killed, his crown lost with his life, and the exile was proclaimed king in his place. The wheel had come full circle, the destroyer was destroyed, and the way was open at last for the promise to be kept that would lift the fallen daughter to a throne. The battle that ended the usurper's reign and opened the way for the family's deliverance was a small affair as battles go, fought by no vast armies upon a patch of midland ground. And yet it was one of the most decisive ever fought upon English soil, for it ended a dynasty and a dispute and an age all at once. The exiled claimant of the rival house, who had grown to manhood in poverty and danger abroad, landed at last upon the western coast with a small band of followers and marched inland, gathering what support he could, a desperate venture against a crowned and an established king. The crowned king came against him with the larger force, confident of victory, and the two hosts met upon a meadow in the heart of the kingdom on a summer morning. And there, in the space of a few hours, the fate of the realm was decided. For he was betrayed in the midst of the battle by some of his own chief lords, who held back their forces or went over to the enemy at the crucial hour, so that the ruler found himself abandoned in the press. And rather than flee, he flung himself into the thick of the fighting in a last desperate charge, and was cut down and killed, the last king of his line to die, sword in hand, upon a battlefield. With the usurper dead upon the field, the crown that had fallen from his head was picked up and set upon the brow of the victorious exile, who was proclaimed king upon the spot, the founder of a new line and a new age. It was a strange and a sudden ending to all the bitter agony of the wars, the whole bloody quarrel decided in a single morning upon that midland field. The usurper destroyed, and the exile raised up, and the throne passed in an hour to a new dynasty. And for the broken family of the royal brood, it was deliverance. For the man who had cast them down, and very likely murdered the princes, was dead. His brief and troubled reign ended, and the way was open at last for the promise to be kept that would lift the eldest daughter to her throne. The battle upon that midland ground was the hinge between the old age and the new, the bloody close of the wars and the bright beginning of the peace that followed, and out of it came, for the surviving children of the ruined house, the dawn after their long night. The man who came at last to overturn the usurper and to marry the fallen queen's daughter was himself one of the strangest figures of that age. A claimant who had spent almost his whole life in banishment and danger, and whose rise to the throne was as unlikely as any in the history of the realm. He had been born in troubled times into the losing side of the old quarrel, and had lost his father before his birth. And while he was still a child, the fortunes of his house collapsed, so that he was carried abroad into hiding for his own safety, and there he remained, year after year, a landless and a hunted wanderer, dependent upon the charity and the calculation of foreign princes who sheltered him as a useful pawn. For the better part of his youth and early manhood, he lived thus in exile, his claim to the throne a thin and a distant thing, his life often in danger from those who would have handed him over to his enemies, with little prospect, through all those years, of ever coming into his own. That such a man, a long exiled wanderer with a slender claim, should have ended as the founder of a great dynasty, is one of the most improbable turns of that whole improbable age, and it could never have come to pass but for the ruin of the Queen's family and the crimes of the usurper. For it was the murder of the princes and the casting down of the old royal house that cleared the field and gave the exile his chance, made him the natural rallying point for all who hated the usurper, and joined his cause to that of the fallen queen through the marriage that was promised. His long years of waiting and danger were rewarded at last upon the field of battle, where he won, in a single morning, the crown that had seemed forever beyond his reach, and he founded upon that victory, and upon his marriage to the Queen's daughter, a line of kings that would rule for generations. The unlikely wanderer became the father of a dynasty, and the fallen daughter of the ruined house became its mother. And out of the meeting of those two unlikely destinies came the healing of all the long wars. So it was that the eldest of the Queen's children, the firstborn princess who had been a king's daughter, and then a declared bastard, and then a cast-down survivor, came at the last to the highest place of all, and was made the Queen of England. The new sovereign kept the bargain that had been struck, and married the eldest daughter of the old royal house, and in their marriage the bitter and bloody quarrel that had torn the kingdom for a generation was at last laid to rest. The rival roses of the two warring houses joined and reconciled in the persons of the bride and groom. The princess who had been born to such fair hopes and seen them all destroyed, who had lost her father and her brothers and her royal name, was raised up again to be a crowned queen, the mother of a new line of kings that would unite in its blood the claims of both the houses that had bled each other white. It was a strange and a wonderful turn, the healing of all that bitter agony in the marriage of one of its victims. The white rose and the red joined at last in the person of the Queen's eldest daughter. And from that marriage would spring a line of monarchs that would rule the kingdom for more than 100 years, so that the broken family's blood flowed on, through its one triumphant daughter, into the whole future history of the realm. The marriage that raised the eldest daughter to her throne did more than restore the fortunes of one fallen family, for it healed a wound that had bled the kingdom for a generation, and it is worth dwelling on the meaning of that union. The new king was the heir and the champion of the one royal house, the bride, the daughter, and the heiress of the other. And in joining them in marriage, The two lines that had torn the realm apart in their long and deadly quarrel were united at last. Their rival claims merged in the persons of the husband and the wife, so that their children would carry the blood and the right of both houses together, and no further ground for quarrel would remain. Men spoke of it as the joining of the two roses, the white and the red, the emblems of the two warring houses brought together at last in a single flower, and the new monarch took as his badge a rose that combined the two, the visible sign that the long division was healed, and a new and a united age begun. It was a marriage of the deepest symbolic weight, the reconciliation of a divided kingdom embodied in the union of a single pair, and it brought to a close, at last, the age of the roses. From that marriage sprang a new line of kings, and the blood of the broken family flowed on through the eldest daughter into the whole future of the realm. She bore the new king children, who carried in their veins the mingled claims of both the houses, and from them descended the long line of monarchs who would rule the kingdom for more than 100 years through all the changes of the age that followed. So the house that had seemed utterly destroyed, its princes murdered, and its name cast down, lived on after all, carried forward through its one surviving daughter into the royal succession of kings. The blood of the lost prince's own sister flowed in the veins of every monarch who came after, so that the ruined house was not extinguished but transformed, its inheritance passing through the daughter who endured. There is a deep and a satisfying justice in it, that the family brought so low should rise again through the gentlest and the most enduring of its children, and that the wound of the wars should be healed by the marriage of one of the war's own victims. And it is the one bright thread that runs through all the darkness of their story, the redemption that waited at the very end. There is a particular poignancy in the fact that the boy who had been proclaimed king was never crowned, for the crowning of a king was the most sacred of all the observances of that age, and to be denied, it was to be denied the very seal of kingship. In the reckoning of the medieval mind, a king was not fully a sovereign by mere succession alone. He became truly and sacredly a king only when he was anointed and crowned in the solemn act of coronation, when the holy oil was laid upon him and the crown set upon his head, and he was joined, by that solemn sacrament, to God and to his people, in a bond that could never be undone. The anointing in particular was held to work a kind of transformation, setting the ruler apart from common men, marking him as the Lord's chosen, sacred and inviolable, and until that rite was performed, a king-elect was king only in name and expectation, awaiting the ceremony that would make his kingship complete and unassailable. For the boy king, that completing ceremony was prepared, and then forever withheld, and therein lay a part of his tragedy and his vulnerability. A day had been set for his crowning, the preparations begun, the grand observance made ready that would have sealed him as the anointed king and set him past the reach of any who might dispute his right. But the crowning was put off, and put off again, and then quietly abandoned, as his uncle's design unfolded and the boy was edged from the throne. Had he been crowned and anointed in time, it might have gone harder for those who sought to unseat him. For to cast down a consecrated king was a fearful sacrilege that even the boldest might have shrunk from. But he was never given that protection, snatched from the throne in the very interval before his crowning, a king who never received sacred seal of kingship. He passed into the fortress and out of the world as a king-elect and never a crowned king, and the empty rite that was prepared for him and never performed stands as a small, sharp emblem of all that was taken from him. The crown held out and then withdrawn, the kingship promised and never fulfilled. The marriage of the eldest daughter to the new ruler bore fruit in a fresh nursery of children, and through these descendants of the fallen queen, the blood of the broken family was carried forward into the line of kings that ruled for generations after. The firstborn daughter, become a queen in her turn, proved as fruitful as her mother had been, and bore her royal husband, a family of boys and girls, who united in their very persons the claims of the two houses whose quarrel had torn the realm apart. There was an eldest son, the hope of the new dynasty, betrothed in his boyhood to a foreign princess, and seeming to promise a long and a secure succession. There was a second son, who would in time come to the throne in his brother's place, and reign as one of the most famous and the most formidable of all the kings of his nation. And there were daughters too, who would be married to foreign kings and carry the blood of their grandmother into the royal houses of other lands. Those grandchildren grew up in a world their mother's people had never known, a settled and a peaceful realm where the crown passed without armies and the old quarrel was a closing memory rather than a present terror. The two vanished brothers had left no heirs of their bodies, snuffed out in boyhood before they could wed. But what the murdered princes could not do, their sister did in their stead, and the offspring of her body inherited at last all that should by rights have been theirs, the unshaken throne and the unquestioned title. It is a strange thought that the murdered princes and the scattered princesses of that ruined nursery should have their blood carried down, through the one daughter who triumphed, into the veins of all the monarchs of a great dynasty. But so it was, and the house that seemed wholly destroyed in that terrible spring lived on, transformed and exalted in the royal line that sprang from its one surviving and triumphant child. The grandchildren of the fallen queen inherited a peace and a security their grandmother had never known, and built upon the union of the roses a throne more settled than any the realm had seen in living memory. The remaining sisters, those who had weathered the storm, found their harbours one by one in the quieter years that came after, and their several endings were gentler, by far, than their beginnings had threatened. Settled in wedlock to lords of the victorious party, they became great ladies of the new reign, mistresses of broad estates and mothers of well-born heirs, their stormy girlhoods giving way to the long ordinary business of households and children. One of them, the youngest of all the children, kept the vow of her girlhood and gave herself wholly to religion, passing her days as a nun in her quiet convent, withdrawn from the world that had used her house so hard, praying out her life in the cloister, far from courts and crowns. The eldest of the half-brothers, the surviving son of the Queen's first marriage, came through the storm as well, restored to favour under the new king and surviving into the new age, the last of that older generation of the family. And the mother of them all, the Queen who had borne the 12 children and outlived so many of them, passed her last years quietly in a religious house, withdrawn from the court where she had once reigned, and died there at length in retirement, to be buried without great ceremony beside the husband whose love had raised her so high, and whose death had been the beginning of all her sorrows. The surviving daughters of the Queen, those who were not raised to a throne, passed their lives in the new age that followed the brood's fall, and their several fates are worth the telling. For they were the threads by which the blood of the broken house was woven into the nobility of the land. Of the princesses who lived to grow, several were married in the years after the new sovereign came to power, to high noblemen of his court, wedded to lords, and made the mothers of well-born children, their royal blood passing on into the great families with whom they were matched. One was wedded to a nobleman of the new king's circle and bore him children. Another was married to a high lord of an ancient house, and carried the blood of kings into that proud line. And so the daughters of the ruined family, who had once been promised to the thrones and the duchies of Europe, came in the end to the humbler, but the safer estate of noble English ladies, wives and mothers in the settled peace of the new age. They had been princesses in their cradles and bastards in their girlhood, and great ladies in their maturity, and through all those changes of fortune they carried forward the blood of their house into the generations that came after. These were not glittering destinies, by the measure of the dazzling futures once planned for them. But they were lives, full and ordinary, lived out in honour and security, and that was no small thing for the girls of a brood that had been so cruelly used. They had survived, which their brothers had not. They had come through the fire and lived to grow old, to marry and bear children, and take their places among the nobility of a kingdom at peace. And if the world had given them far less than their fathers had once designed for them, it had at least given them their lives and a measure of contentment, which in that hard age was no small thing. The daughters of the Queen who survived to grow old were the quiet survivors of a loud catastrophe, the ones who endured when so many of their family perished, and through them, as through their queenly eldest sister, the blood and the memory of the broken house were carried forward into the calmer years that followed the storm. The youngest of all the Queen's children, the last daughter born to the monarch and Queen in the final years before the catastrophe, was allotted a fate quite unlike that of her sisters, for she did not marry into the nobility, but gave herself wholly to religion, and passed her years as a nun. While still a small child, she was marked for the cloister, and in due time she entered a convent of holy women, where she took the vows of religion and put off the world forever, exchanging the silk and the splendour of her birth for the plain habit of a nun and the quiet round of prayer. It was not so strange a fate as it might seem, for it was common enough in that age for a daughter of a high family to be vowed to the church, to live out her life in a convent, in prayer and contemplation, and such a calling was held in high honour. The cloister was a refuge and a vocation both, a place where a high-born woman might live in dignity and devotion, withdrawn from the dangers and the disappointments of the age. And for this youngest daughter, born into a family that the world had used so cruelly, there may have been a real mercy in that withdrawal, a peace in the quiet of the cloister that her sisters in the turbulent world never knew. While her family was torn apart by the great catastrophe, while her brothers vanished and her mother fled to sanctuary, and her sisters were dragged through every reversal of fortune, this youngest child was set apart in her convent, shielded from the worst of the storm by the walls of her holy house, given over to a round of prayer that lifted her above the quarrels of kings. She lived out her days in that quiet vocation, praying, it may be, for the souls of the brothers she had lost and the family that had suffered so much, passing her years in the ordered calm of the cloister, while the age went on its turbulent way outside. Of all the fates that befell the Queen's 12 children, hers was perhaps the most peaceful, the daughter who fled into religion and found, in the quiet of the convent, a haven from the storms that had wrecked her house. And there is something fitting in the thought that one of that much-tried family should have ended her days in prayer and peace, withdrawn from the world that had dealt so cruelly with her kin. The elder of the two half-brothers, the Queen's first son by her early marriage, came through the storm that destroyed so much of his family, and his survival is worth a word, for he was the last living link to the older generation of that house. While his younger brother perished upon the block, this elder half-brother escaped the worst of the catastrophe, and in the dangerous years of the usurpation he threw in his lot with the banished claimant who was gathering the enemies of the man on the throne, going abroad to join the cause that would in the end prevail. He shared for a time in the perils and the uncertainties of that exile, one of the band of desperate men who had staked everything on overturning the usurper, and when at last the venture succeeded and the exile won his crown, the half-brother returned with the victors into the new age, restored to his honours and his estates under the new monarch who had married his half-sister. His later years were not without their shadows, for he fell at times under the suspicion of the wary new king, who trusted few and watched all, and who could not quite forget that this man's blood and history tied him to the troubled past. But he weathered these clouds and kept his place, and lived on into the settled years of the new reign, dying at length in his bed, full of years, the last survivor of the Queen's elder children. He had seen the whole arc of his family's fortune, from the golden days of his stepfather's court, through the catastrophe that destroyed his brother and his royal half-brothers, to the restoration that came with his half-sister's marriage to the throne. He had lived through it all and come out the other side, one of the few of that ill-starred family to die quietly in his bed in his own time. The elder half-brother was the chief survivor of the Queen's brood, the one who rode out every storm, and in his long life he carried the memory of the whole tragedy, from its bright beginning to its strange and partial healing. The mother of all these little ones, the Queen who had borne them and raised them and striven so fiercely for them, passed her own last years in a quiet that stood in strange contrast to the storms of her earlier life, and it is fitting to dwell for a moment on her ending. After the marriage of her eldest daughter to the new ruler had lifted her kin to safety and her grandchildren toward the throne, the old Queen withdrew, whether by her own choice or by the gentle pressure of the new king, into a religious house, an abbey not far from the capital, where she lived out her remaining years in retirement from the court where she had once reigned. There, in the calm of the abbey, the woman who had been lifted from obscurity to a throne and then cast down into ruin and raised up again through her daughter, passed her final seasons in prayer and quiet, far from the splendour and the danger that had filled her earlier days. It was a peaceful ending for a woman whose life had been so full of violent turns, and there may have been a real contentment in it, the rest of one who had endured every extreme of fortune and come at last to a quiet harbour. She had outlived her royal husband and most of her many children, had buried her infants and lost her princes, and seen her family all but destroyed. But she had lived too, to see her eldest daughter made a queen and her grandchildren secure upon the path to the throne, to know that her blood would flow on in the line of kings despite everything that had been done to her house. When she died, in the quiet of her abbey, she was buried without pomp beside the husband whose love had raised her so high, so long before, the sovereign for whom she had given up her widowhood, and with whom she had built the great family that fortune had treated so cruelly. So ended the Queen, who had been the mother of 12 children, in peace at the last, after a life that had carried her through every height and every depth that the wheel of fortune could show. It is fitting, as we come toward the close of their story, to think for a moment of the still places where the members of this much-tried family at last lay down. For there is a peace in those graves that their lives so seldom knew. The father, the great king, who had been the centre of it all, was laid to rest in a splendid minster that he had himself begun to build, a fair house of God upon the height above the river, where his bones were set in the state befitting a monarch. And there, long after, his queen was brought to lie beside him, the wife of his love set down at last, next to the husband who had raised her so high. The two of them reunited in death, after all the storms that had parted them in life. In that quiet chapel, the sovereign and queen who had founded the wide family lie together still, side by side through the centuries. Their old quarrel with fortune ended, their troubles all behind them. As for the boys and girls, they came to their sleep in scattered places, as their lives had scattered them. The little ones who died in the nursery were buried in their small graves long before the great catastrophe. The sisters who lived to grow old were buried, each in her turn, in the churches of the proud families into which they had married, or in the stillness of the convent where the youngest had passed her days. And the two lost princes, whose end was so long a mystery, were given at last, when their supposed bones were found in a later age, a place of sleep among the tombs of the kings, honoured in death as they had not been allowed to live, laid to rest with honour in the great church, where the monarchs of the realm were crowned and buried. So the scattered family came, one by one, to their various graves, the king and queen reunited in their chapel, the daughters in their married churches, the princes among the royal tombs. And the story that had begun in such splendor and passed through such sorrow ended, as all such stories end, in the silence and the peace of the tomb, where the cherished and the lost, the crowned and the murdered, lie down together at last in the same quiet earth. What, then, are we to make of the story of these 12 children, this proud family lifted so high and cast down so cruelly? It is, above all, a story of fortune's terrible reversals, of the heights and the depths that a single family could be made to know in the space of a few short years. Raised to the summit of a kingdom, and then dashed down into ruin and death, the brightest hopes turned to the blackest sorrows almost overnight. It is a tale of the innocence of children, caught in the machinery of power, of boys and girls who had done no wrong, destroyed, or scattered, or stripped of all they had, because of the throne they stood near and the blood they carried. For the siblings themselves were guilty of nothing, and yet they paid the fullest price for the ambitions and the hatreds of the grown men around them. And it is a tale, at the very last, of survival and of healing, of the one daughter who carried the broken family through the darkness and into a new dawn, whose marriage closed the long wound of the wars, and whose children carried the blood of all her lost brothers and sisters forward into the ages to come. The 12 sons and daughters of the Queen did not all perish. Through the one who survived and triumphed, the whole family lived on, woven into the line of kings, so that the nursery that was shattered in that terrible spring was not, in the end, wholly destroyed, but flowed on, transformed, into the future of the realm. There is an idea that the people of that age were deeply fond of, and that the story of this brood seems almost to have been designed to illustrate the old idea of fortune's turning wheel, and it is worth dwelling on as the night draws toward its close. The men and women of the Middle Ages pictured fortune as a vast revolving orb upon which all the affairs of the world were bound. And as it wheeled about, those who had been at the top were swept down to the bottom, and those at the bottom were lifted to the top in an endless revolution that no one could halt or escape. It was their way of grasping the terrible reversals they saw all around them. The sudden falls of the mighty and the unlooked-for rise of the humble, the way in which the highest estate could be overturned in a moment and the most secure grandeur brought to nothing. Fortune was a fickle mistress, forever spinning her orb, and the higher a man had climbed upon it, the further he had to fall when it turned against him. And the only wisdom was to remember, in prosperity, that the orb was always in motion, and to hold one's greatness lightly, knowing how soon it might be snatched away. The story of the Queen's children is the very pattern of that old idea, a tale of that turning orb running through its whole revolution, from the summit to the depths, and for one of them, back to the summit again. They had been born at the very summit of it, the children of the most powerful man in the kingdom, raised as high as fortune could lift them, and then it turned, as it always turns, and carried them down into ruin and death. The princes murdered, the clan scattered, the bright estate dashed to pieces, and then, for the one daughter who endured, the orb turned once more and lifted her up again, up from the depths of her house's disgrace to a throne of her own, the very pattern of fortune's restless motion. It is a story that the people of that age would have understood at once, and drawn from it the lesson they were always drawing, that no estate is secure, that the orb is always turning, that the mighty of today may be the ruined of tomorrow, and that wisdom lies in holding fast, through all the revolutions of it, to the things that fortune cannot touch. Of all the many sorrows of that violent age, it is the fate of these young ones, and above all of the 2 lost princes, that has lingered most in the memory of the after generations, and it is worth asking why their story, out of so many tragedies, should have kept so strong a hold upon the hearts of those who came after. Part of it, surely, is the sheer pathos of the thing, the spectacle of children, destroyed by the ambition of their elders of innocent boys and girls caught in the machinery of power and ground to pieces through no fault of their own. For there is no sorrow that touches the human heart more deeply than the suffering of children. And these were children of the most exalted station, brought from the very summit of fortune to ruin and death. And part of it is the mystery that hangs over the prince's end, the not knowing that has never been resolved, which has kept the question alive across the centuries as a settled tale could never have remained alive, drawing each new generation to wonder afresh what befell the two boys in the dark of the fortress. So the memory of this brood has been carried down the generations, told and retold, mourned and debated. The two vanished princes becoming one of the most enduring and the most haunting of all the stories of their nation's past. They have been pitied and lamented by people who lived centuries after their deaths, their fate held up as the very emblem of innocence destroyed by ambition, their mystery turned over endlessly by those who could not let it rest. And in this long remembrance there is a kind of justice, perhaps, a recompense of memory for boys and girls robbed of their lives and their futures, that they should be so little forgotten, so long lamented, so deeply held in the heart of the ages that followed. The Queen's offspring, who lost so much, gained at least this, an undying place in the memory of their people, and the two little princes who vanished into the fortress have outlived in fame all the proud and powerful men who destroyed them, remembered with pity and with love, long after their destroyers are recalled only with loathing or not at all. There is a hard truth that runs through the whole story of this brood, and that is worth pausing on as we near the end. The truth that the royal blood, which was their glory, was also their curse, and that the very nearness to the throne that made them great was the thing that destroyed them. To be born of the blood royal, close in line to the crown, was to be lifted above all other mortals, clothed in splendour and reverence, and the brightest hopes the world could offer. But it was also to be marked, from birth, as a piece in the deadliest game of all, a possible rival or a possible threat to whoever held or coveted the throne. The same blood that made the princes heirs to a kingdom made them, in the eyes of an ambitious uncle, obstacles to be removed. The same royalty that promised the princesses thrones and crowns made them pawns to be bargained and counters to be used. Their nearness to the crown was a double inheritance, a gift and a danger inseparably joined, and in the end it was the danger that prevailed. For in that age, and in the deadly logic of dynastic struggle, those closest to the throne were always the most exposed, the most watched, the most likely to be struck down when the game turned violent. A child of common blood might have passed his days in safety and obscurity, but a child of the blood royal could never be safe so long as he stood in someone's path to power. The very thing that the world envied in these boys and girls, their royal birth, was the thing that doomed them. Had they been born lower, they might have lasted longer, but they would not have been themselves. It is one of the bitterest ironies of their story, and of many such stories in that age, that the glory and the curse were one and the same. That to be born so high was to be born so endangered, and that the children who had everything the world could give were destroyed precisely by the greatness of their birth. The royal blood was their crown and their doom together, and there was no way for them to have the one without the other. And so we come to the close of their troubled tale, and it is time to let the Queen's children rest. Theirs was a story of the most violent contrasts, of splendour and terror, of the highest fortune and the deepest grief, lived out by children who had no choice in any of it, who were lifted up and cast down by forces far beyond their understanding or control. Some of them died in the cradle, mourned and soon forgotten. 2 of them vanished into a fortress and broke the heart of an age. 1 of them was beheaded in a far castle for the crime of his blood, and the rest survived, scarred and scattered into the new world that rose from the ruins of the old. When we remember the famous quarrels of that distant age, the kings and the battles and the seizing of crowns, let us remember too these young ones who were caught in the midst of it. The Queen's 12 small ones, who paid for the ambitions of their elders, with their childhoods and sometimes with their lives, and one of whom, against all the odds, lived to heal the very wound that had destroyed the rest. There are 2 pictures of the royal brood that we might carry away with us into the quiet of the night. The first is the scene of the nursery in its golden hour, the warm, bright chamber full of royal children, the little princes and princesses in their silk and their splendour. All the brood of them gathered safe and cherished at the very summit of the kingdom, with all their bright futures spread before them, and not a shadow yet upon the scene. Hold that picture a moment, the brood of the Queen in their innocent glory, before the darkness came, when the worst that could be imagined seemed impossibly far away, and the warm nursery with its candles and its tapestries was the sum of their happy world. And then set against it the second, a vision of the one who survived, the eldest daughter standing at the last in her own queenly splendour, crowned and honoured, the mother of kings to come. The white rose blooming again upon the broken stem. She had lost everything, this eldest daughter, her father and her brothers and her royal name, and had been dragged through every depth of sorrow her cruel age could devise, and yet she had endured, and risen, and triumphed in the end, carrying in herself all that was left of the broken family, and passing it on, whole and living, to the generations that came after. Between those 2 pictures, the bright nursery and the surviving queen, the golden beginning and the hard-won healing, lies the whole long story of these 12 children, and the meaning of it too, that even the cruelest fortune does not always have the last word, and that out of the deepest ruin, some living thing may yet be carried forward into the light. So let them rest now, the Queen's 12 children, the cherished and the lost, the princes who vanished and the princess who endured, in the deep quiet that gathers at the end of every story, however troubled. Let the warm nursery and the cold sanctuary and the grey fortress by the river all fall silent together. Let the boys and girls who died in the cradle, and the boys who died in the dark, and the princesses who lived to grow old, all lie down at last in the same gentle peace. The sorrows are all ended now, the old quarrel is healed, the wheel has stopped its turning, and the young ones who were caught up in such terror and such grief have come home at last to the only rest that waits for all of us alike. There is nothing left to fear now, no more crowns to lose, no more partings to endure, no more darkness to dread, only the quiet and the stillness and the long ease of sleep. And as their world grows dim and still around us, let yours grow dim and still as well. The night is far on now, and you have travelled a long way back into it, and there is nothing left for you to hold on to. Let the candles of that vanished nursery gutter out one by one. Let the old voices fade. Let the warmth of your own bed gather you in, and your breath grow slow and even. And your thoughts loosen their hold and begin to drift away into the dark, down toward the place where the story and the sleeper become one, and the night closes gently over all. Before you slip away entirely, let me thank you, quietly, for spending these few hours of the night in such old and faraway company. If the evening we have passed together is the kind of journey you would care to take again, you are always welcome to subscribe, whenever the wish should come to you. And another of these quiet nights will find its way to you in time. There is no hurry about any of it. It is simply here, waiting, whenever you should want to come back. But that is a matter for the daylight, and the daylight is far off. For now, there is only the night, and the rest you have earned. And the last few words I leave with you as you go: sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.